Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the heavens opened and the staunchly unwavering rain pelted down without apology. The pertinacious gunmetal grey sky grew more threatening and foreboding with every passing minute. A flock of black ravens with open beaks squawked loudly as they flew past Mrs. Ashbluff's white Volkswagen truck in a long ribbon of gleaming black feathers towards the tall canopy of the trees, where lightly they would acquire shelter from these indomitable rain showers that looked unlikely to abate. Mrs. Ashbluff sighed with relief that she had both of her children safely in the back of her truck. They were as dry as toast, thank goodness. Thank goodness I picked you both up from school in the nick of time. It's sheeting down out there, isn't it? If I'd picked you up any later, you'd both be soaked to the skin. I dread to think. We might still get wet, Mum, her son Braden reminded her. We still have to make it back into the house when we get back without getting wet, and that's not going to be easy if the rain continues like this. It's a soaking rain. Well, we need to be grateful for rain, don't we? It's very good for the countryside. It turns everything green, so I'm not about to complain about the weather. But I will say this, it certainly knows how to pick its moments. Why does it always pelt down with rain when you're hanging out the washing or trying to sweep the path clear of leaves? It's never convenient. It always catches you off guard. Anyway, enough of that, sweethearts. I've got great news. I've got an umbrella in here, said Mrs. Ashbluff reassuringly. She glanced through her visor mirror at her daughter Kirsten, who was sitting on the back seat of the white truck, staring at the rain blankly, not saying a word. Mrs. Ashbluff was clandestinely very concerned for her daughter. She had noticed of late that Kirsten had lost her sparkle. She was a shadow of what she had been only 6 months before. It would seem her daughter had been so happy at her old school, but after they moved to the countryside, everything had changed quite dramatically, and regretfully not all for the good. Mr. and Mrs. Ashbluff had eagerly sold their old house in Denver, where they'd lived in the green leafy South Park neighborhood, close to the Denver Zoo and the Children's Hospital, where Mrs. Ashbluff had worked as a receptionist during the day, while her children attended the Cherry Creek High School in Denver. When her husband had discovered that he could do most of his work online, behind a computer, the couple had decided to move. Mrs. Ashbluff enjoyed her job as a receptionist, interacting with the doctors and staff at the Children's Hospital, but it had not been a difficult decision to swap their old life in Denver for a life in the Colorado countryside. They had moved into a charming wooden ranch-style farmhouse. Indeed, it was a beautiful place to live, surrounded by transfixing picturesque mountain views, rolling hills, horse-riding trails, magnificent wood groves of trees, and viridescent meadows that sparkled cheerfully under the first flush of the morning sun. What was there not to like about living in this utterly exquisite part of the world? Moving here had been a no-brainer for the delighted couple, who both believed raising their kids in the natural world would only serve to enhance their quality of life. Yet Mrs. Ashbluff, whom had thought moving would be pretty straightforward, and relatively uncomplicated, was to find she could not have been more wrong about that. Any form of natural adjustment was never easy, of course. Some aspects of their lives had slotted so perfectly into place, while others were dreadfully out of alignment, almost unhinged, so much so she couldn't get them to fit together, no matter how hard she tried. The major issue concerned the new school that Kirsten attended, that did not seem to be agreeing with her daughter. She had regretfully watched Kirsten retreat into her shell, like a tortoise becoming more and more detached and apathetic towards her life, as if she was caught up in a protective cocoon from which she did not want to escape. "I'm really worried about Kirsten," she had told her husband Logan. "I don't think she's settling down at her new school very well. She was so happy at her last school in Denver, but she's dreadfully out of sorts these days. She's not a happy bunny anymore, I'm afraid. That girl might as well be wearing barbs on her clothes, as she knows how to pierce you with her words if you probe into her life. I can't remember the last time I saw her laugh. The only time I see her smiling is when she's with the horses, or taking Sunbeam for a ride. She loves her horse, but she hates that school she attends with a passion. I can see it in her eyes. A mother knows these things." "You worry too much, sweetheart," her husband Logan had teased. "That's why I love you so very much. You put everybody else before yourself. You're selfless like that, but you need to relax. I'm sure it's only a matter of adjustment for Kirsten. It's not easy to start from scratch and make brand new friends. It's a work in progress, is it not? But she'll get there in the end. I have faith in our Kirsten. Even for me, working in this new environment has taken a while to get used to, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I love it out here, and I'm very glad we moved from Denver." "I agree with you wholeheartedly," said Tessa Ashcroft. "I mean, look at our Braden. Our son is positively blossoming. He's made a plethora of new friends. But I just don't get the impression that Kirsten has made any friends at all at that new school of hers. And that irks and unsettles me greatly. It can be very soul-destroying having no friends, you know." "All in good time, sweetheart," Logan had said to his wife lovingly. "What do they say? Rome was not built in a day. You mark my words, in a year's time, Kirsten will be very happy at her new school. It probably takes longer for her to adapt, that's all. We're not made of the same stuff. Some of us take time to resettle. I think you could put our Braden in a forest with a tent. He would have harmonized to his territory within hours, let alone days. Braden is like a chameleon. He naturally just adapts. Let's face it, even when Caitlin first entered the world, don't you remember? It was a struggle to get her to be born. Even the midwife said as much. She didn't want to leave the safety of your womb. But let's just say Braden couldn't get out fast enough. You delivered him in our truck on the way to the hospital, before even the EMTs got to you. Don't you remember? Never been so scared in all my life. That boy of ours wanted to be born, but Kirsten, she's always been reluctantly wary about most things, much more guarded and withdrawn. That's who she is. But there's nothing to worry about there." Mrs. Ashbluff glances at her daughter once again, through the visor mirror. The rain continues to bucket down. The asphalt road glistens from the gleaming water that shines on its surface, while the surrounding countryside twinkles and sparkles under the raindrops as the dust is washed away, and leaves from the trees begin to brighten. They can hear the ominous booms of thunder drum-rolling in the distance, but luckily Mrs. Ashbluff has not caught any lightning flashes trespassing across the sky. She's quite sure the storm will soon pass. "Kirsten, tell me, how was your day at school, sweetheart?" She can see her daughter's lips turn down into an upside-down smile or scowl, another dreadful habit that she developed soon after they moved here. Her daughter used to always smile, but the last time Kirsten was really happy was at her goodbye party in Denver, when everyone was bidding her farewell and wishing her good luck for her new life. Everyone was desperately sad to see Kirsten go. She had been very popular at the old school and had acquired tons of friends there. But since they had moved here, Kirsten did not appear to have made any friends. She hadn't made any progress in that regard, and that was very upsetting to Mrs. Ashbluff, who was desirous for both of her children to be very happy here. "Why do you always ask me about school, Mum? How was your day? How was this? How was that? I told you everything you need to know. I hate it here. I want to go back to Denver to my old school. I loved it there. I had good friends." "You know you can't, sweetheart. That's not an option for you anymore. Surely you must have made some friends here, darling. It can't be all that bad. There must be some lovely girls in your class at school. Perhaps if you tried to interact with them, things would be different for you. I mean, you're naturally shy by nature. You listen to yourself, Mum. You prattle on and on and on, telling me what I should do and what I shouldn't do. You don't understand how it works. So quit asking your nauseating, insufferable questions. You don't know what it's like living in our generation. You're clueless. You lived in a day and age when your phones were connected to the house. You didn't have social media or Instagram. You come from a completely different world to ours." "You make me sound as if I'm so long in the tooth and obsolete. I do have my uses, you know, sweetheart. I'm not a dinosaur. Why don't you explain it to me, darling? I'd like to understand. Maybe I could help. Help, Mum? You know what? If you really want to help me, Mum, keep your nosy, interfering bat out of my business, will you?" Mrs. Ashbluff ignores her daughter's thorny, barbed reactions. She's well used to them by now, and although her daughter can be bristly and brusque, she knows she is hurting, and as a mother it breaks her heart not to know how to help her daughter. She puts on the radio as a means of distraction, to iron out the tension that, like a bad smell, has wafted over her truck. Her children remain quietly silent, barring the unwelcome distraction from the rude music that is blaring through the radio, caught amidst some obstructive static reception. It's amazing how the mountains can intractably interfere with the radio and cell phone signals, especially in bad weather like this. They drive through the countryside back to the farmhouse. It's always so pleasant, as Mrs. Ashbluff never fails to be enchanted by the scenery. Her hard-working husband is probably bustling around in his study, working online, making big deals from behind his computer, in a tiny, rather uninspiring office. Sometimes Logan is so diligently hard-working that he works through lunch, and she only ever sees him in the late afternoon, when he takes a much-needed exercise break, by riding his American quarter horse in the countryside. It seems her husband has bonded with that horse Fairfield, but so has Kirsten, who couldn't ride when they first moved here, but now she's a natural on horseback, and is very attached to the two horses they have. When Kirsten gets back from school, she would usually head straight to the meadow, with reins in her hands to saddle up Fairfield and take him for a ride. The horse was a likeable character, benevolent, friendly, very warm-hearted. Mrs. Ashbluff is so pleased about this, as she knows that when her daughter rides Fairfield, it's an excellent way for her to let off some of her steam. But these days she's also riding her beloved Sunbeam, a black and bay American quarter horse, whom she's broken in very successfully when she gained the horse's trust. Sunbeam was recently rescued from a nearby farm, where she was so emaciated and was going to be put down as she'd been cruelly abused by the former owner. It would seem Kirsten had seen a photograph of the half-starved horse in the local paper and had insisted in rescuing the creature. She had wept and wept about the horse until her parents had relented and taken their daughter to visit the creature. The shelter was going to put down Sunbeam, but Kirsten begged them to let her adopt the horse. "I promise I'll make him better," she told the shelter. "It's too far gone, sweetheart," she had been told. "But if you really want to take care of the horse and take him off our hands, good luck to you." By some miraculous twist of fate, and against all the tumultuous odds stacked against Sunbeam, the tenacious horse had miraculously fully recovered, thanks to the devoted diligence of Kirsten's care. It was hard to believe a horse that looked like a walking corpse stood a chance of getting well again, but Kirsten had not given up on him, and her determination to make that horse better was all-consuming. There had been times she'd slept in the stable overnight with the horse, nursing him through the night, refusing to leave his side. She had talked to him and told him that he could pull through anything, that she had faith in him. It would seem prodigiously that the American quarter horse Sunbeam had regained all the weight he'd lost. But not only that, the family were immensely surprised to see what a spectacular specimen Sunbeam was. His coat gleamed, his temperament was kind. The horse did not trust men, as it had been abused by a man, so there was no way that Kirsten's father could ride Sunbeam, but he was devoted to Kirsten. The presence of Sunbeam was the only positive thing that had happened in Kirsten's life since the family had moved to the farmhouse, as both the horses made her very happy. It was a dreadful pity that Kirsten seemed unable to listen to her own sagacious, judicious advice that she had so willingly given Sunbeam when he was hanging on to the threads of his own life, on unsteady, rather wobbly legs that were almost failing to support his withering form. Let's just say that no one felt her daughter's lugubrious desolation more than Tessa Ashbluff herself. When any of her children were hurting, so was she. She was growing increasingly concerned about her daughter's well-being, and was hesitantly reluctant to discuss the matter any further with her husband. She felt Logan, although well-meaning, was dismissive to her grievous concerns, brushing them away indifferently, as if he thought she was overreacting and being far too melodramatic. He was not taking their daughter's emotional state of mind seriously enough, and Tessa Ashcroft could not shake off the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong with her daughter, and this sense of foreboding ate into her heart like a worm devouring its way through an apple. It was almost as if a church bell of warning was ringing through her bloodstream, telling her to pay attention. Logan had always been an easygoing character, who always saw the good in everything. He failed to see that not every cloud had a silver lining. "Here we are! Home at last! Isn't that wonderful?" says Mrs. Ashbluff, as her Volkswagen rolls eagerly down the long gravel dirt driveway towards the farmhouse. There was no doubt that this farmhouse was as pretty as a picture, happily nestled in the valley, surrounded by the distant sculptural backdrop of the mountains that stood erect and proud against the bleak pewter colour of the clouds, which made everything look dramatic as the rain continued to splatter down. "We're going to have to make a dash to the farmhouse with my umbrella," says Mrs. Ashbluff. "I'll take you to the house first, Kirsten, and then I'll come back for you, Braden. How about that? This way we'll avoid being saturated by rain." "Don't you worry about me, Mum," said Braden. "I don't mind getting wet. I'm not a sissy. A little rain never hurt anyone." When they managed to get into the house, Kirsten dropped all her things on the kitchen table and bolted towards the kitchen door. She was clearly going outside. "Where are you going?" asked her mother. "You don't want to go out there. You'll get soaked to the skin." "I'm taking the horses to the stable block," said Kirsten. "Look at them. They're getting drenched in the rain. I'm sure Sunbeam is getting scared with the booming thunder in the distance. They both look so miserable out there, getting wet. I need to bring them into the dry." "You'll get wet yourself," said her mother. "Do I look like I care?" says Kirsten. "I have a duty of responsibility to both of those horses, and that's what I care about." Mrs. Ashbluff watched her daughter, dashing out in the pouring rain, running towards the horses in the meadow, who were trying to shelter under a large oak tree. They looked relieved to see Kirsten, and to be guided safely to the confines of their warm and dry stable block, away from the pounding, unrelenting rain. Mrs. Ashbluff could see her daughter was getting soaked to the skin, but she didn't appear to care. She was fastidiously attending to her horses' every need, no doubt laying down hay and food for them. She knew her daughter adored those horses, and admired her sacrificial spirit. Mrs. Ashbluff saw her daughter's cell phone lying on the kitchen counter. She reached out for it, knowing what she was doing was terribly wrong. She wanted to glance through the messages to see what was going on in her enigmatic daughter's mind. Maybe scanning through her cell phone at this opportune moment, while her daughter was not around, might give her a glimmer of what was actually going on in her life. Her son Braden was drying himself off in the kitchen with a towel. He looked up at her in abject horror, as if his mother was committing a mortal sin. "Mum, what are you doing looking at Kirsten's cell phone? You can't look through her messages. That's prying. I'd kill you if you were looking through my private stuff like that." "I don't want you to tell Kirsten what I'm doing, Braden. It's very important you don't. Sometimes a mother's got to do what a mother's got to do. One day you'll understand, when you have kids of your own. If you must know, I'm not snooping. Well, not really. I'm very worried about your sister. The only thing she cares about at the moment are those horses. She'll do anything for them. Your sister's in a bad place, Braden. I know she is. I'm sure you can see that. Ever since we moved here, she hasn't been herself. Have you noticed how sad she's been of late? It's a botheration for me. I need to make sense of what's actually going on in her life. I hasten to say, Braden, I'd do exactly the same for you if you looked so miserable. I'm glad to say you've settled down to life here triumphantly. But your sister, she's another matter. She's a conundrum. I can't figure her out at all. I need to know what's going on in that little head of hers in order to help her conquer the stumbling blocks that she's facing at the moment. She's not happy, Mum, because she's got no friends at school. That's why she's upset. No one likes her at her new school. She told you that? Yeah, she told me nobody wants to be her friend, and everybody's horrible, especially the girls. But why? I don't understand. She was so popular at her old school. She told me that she eats her lunch at the school canteen all on her own, and the kids whisper and gossip about her behind her back. If she goes and sits near one of them, they pick up their tray and just walk away from her. That's terrible. But why, Braden? Asked Mrs. Ashbluff. Help me to understand why. I mean, she was so popular at her old school, wasn't she? I mean, why would kids choose to be so deliberately mean to her here? It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I don't know, Mum. I know she hates that school. The kids are vile to her, making fun of her behind her back. But then it's her fault. She never stands up for herself, does she? That's her problem. When I started at my school and I saw some kids talking about me on my first day, do you know, I went straight up to them and said, "What are you saying about me? Because if it's not nice, I'll punch your lights out." And they shut up. I'm sorry to say this, Mum, but Kirsten has always been a wet blanket. She's her own worst enemy. People take advantage of you when you've got no backbone. That's not good, said Mrs. Ashbluff, opening her daughter's cell phone, surprised to see that it wasn't locked. Her daughter had sent a text to her best friend in Denver, Lisa Rose. This was interesting. She scrolled down to the message. "Hello, Lisa. Missing you tons. Still no friends. It's a bummer. I hate this school. Everyone is so unfriendly here. They're always whispering and smirking behind my back." "That's awful. Why don't you ask your mum if you can board at our house? My mum wouldn't mind," came Lisa's reply. "You're right," says Mrs. Ashbluff, sighing. "It's official. Your sister hates her school and is struggling to make friends. My heart bleeds for her. What can I do about it?" "There's nothing you can do to help her, Mum. If you interfere, you'll only make her as mad as hell. The only person that can help her is herself. It's her problem, not yours. She's a bit of a closed book, Mum. When she meets new people, she can be very reserved. So that's not exactly going to endear her to the kids at the school. She needs to make a bit of an effort, grow a pair of you-know-what." 2 weeks later, the weekend had arrived, and Mrs. Ashbluff was alone at home with her daughter Kirsten. Her son was away staying with one of his newly acquired friends on their hunting ranch, while her husband Logan was spending a few days abroad on business. He was on a trip to Norway. It was just Mrs. Ashbluff and her daughter alone together under one roof. The quintessential opportunity for Mrs. Ashbluff to spend quality time with her daughter and maybe have a good old chinwag. She wanted to make this evening particularly special, and so had prepared her daughter's favourite dish, Chinese-style sweet and sour chicken and rice. She had followed the recipe from a Chinese chef online and had made it once before very successfully, and Kirsten had told her it tasted better than takeout. Mrs. Ashbluff had promptly decided that the following morning she was going to go out of a limb for her daughter and spoil her rotten, hopefully lifting her out of her dispirited melancholia. She had to do something, as her daughter's spiralling downcast mood over the last day or so had become dolefully stormy. She was snapping at everyone like a turtle and looked incredibly downtrodden, as if she was overwhelmed about the issues of life. And the sinking, disquieted feeling Mrs. Ashbluff had about her daughter's psychological state was growing increasingly more alarmed. She would take her daughter out shopping to look for some pretty summer clothes at the very avant-garde boutique in town that everybody was raving about. Maybe they'd enjoy a relaxing Thai massage together, along with a spot of lunch at a notable Italian restaurant that she knew made the most delicious, authentic Italian pizzas. It was wonderful to have some lone time with her daughter. She had decided they'd watch a movie together this evening after dinner. Mrs. Ashbluff called out to her daughter, whose bedroom was further down the passage. "Kirsten! Kirsten!" she called again. "Dinner is served! Come on, hurry up, it's getting cold!" "Kirsten!" she called again and again, but once again there was no response. Normally at the first sign of dinner being served, especially a dinner like this, which consisted of Kirsten's absolute favourite food, She'd be out of her bedroom like a hungry bullet. She was always ravenous, but not this evening. This behaviour was incongruous, erroneous, and paradoxical for her daughter. In a trice, Mrs. Ashbluff, her prognostic instincts, knew something was terribly wrong. Her stomach shuddered, churned and jolted, as if she'd been shocked with 100 volts of electricity. "No! No!" she cried out. "Please, God, no!" As a harbinger of doom descended on her gut instincts like a vulture out of the sky, and macabre visions where she could see her daughter harming herself came flooding into her mind without restraint. Mrs. Ashbluff senses what she could only describe as a foreshadowing of dread trickling down her spine that nudged her so sharply, like a knife piercing through the guts. Something was terribly wrong. There was no doubt about that. Mrs. Ashcroft speedily dashed towards her daughter's bedroom, but it was empty. There were puddles of clothes scattered across the floor haphazardly, and an unmade bed covered with schoolbooks, with pages that had been torn to shreds, was lying not only over the duvet cover, but across the floor. Her daughter appeared to have scribbled in red crayon over her school textbooks, with the words, "Go and suck eggs." Mrs. Ashcroft ran to the bathroom. It was locked. A steam rose up in a mist of vaporous clouds from under the door. She banged at the door as hard as she could. "Kirsten! Kirsten, are you in there? Kirsten, are you in there? Please let me in. Please let me in. Is everything all right in there?" Once again, there was no response. She could hear the dreadful trickling of water dropping out of a warm tap as it hit the water in the bath, one drop at a time. But there was no other sound. Beyond that, the silence was deafening, the sound of the dripping tap distressingly inauspicious. A pandemonium of sheer panic began to bolt through Mrs. Ashbluff's mind, which became an indeterminable whirl, with ambiguous thoughts she could not grasp, like 1,000 clothes spinning around a washing machine that she couldn't reach. Her heart was pounding in her chest violently, and she found her breathing had become rapid. The very sturdy door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Ashbluff needed to get into that bathroom now, before it was too late. But how was she going to do this? The door was exceedingly well made, tough, unyielding, and sturdy, not easy to break down at all. She feared the worst for her daughter. A dreadful foreboding wrote on the tablet of her heart what she expected she'd find on the other side. A sinking feeling of impending dread seemed to swallow her up alive. She tried to kick the bathroom door open, but it was no use. She wasn't strong enough. The door didn't budge, no matter how hard she kicked it. Worse still, they didn't have a spare key for that bathroom door. Everything that unfolded seemed so surreal to Mrs. Ashbluff, as if it was all happening to somebody else, but not to her. This was insane, she thought. This happens in the movies, not in real life. Not to me. Not to my daughter. Mrs. Ashbluff ran to the outside shed to retrieve an axe. She banged as hard as she could at the door, with an audacious determination that could not be subdued. Soon she'd made a large enough hole in the bathroom door to reach her hand through the jagged opening, to turn the key in the lock. Finally she succeeded in her mission, from sheer determination and brute force. She was greeted to a sight that no parent should ever see. Her daughter was lying in a bath of crimson-coloured water, fully clothed to spare her modesty, and there was an empty bottle of pills lying on the floor beside her. Mrs. Ashbluff ran towards her daughter. Her lamenting heart was booming, her mind screaming, "No, please, no, God, no, please! Wake up, Kirsten! Wake up! For goodness sake, wake up, Kirsten! You've got to wake up!" She began to shake her daughter vigorously. "Wake up, Kirsten! Wake up, please!" Her daughter barely responded. Her eyes were rolling in the back of her head, but Mrs. Ashbluff could detect a faint pulse. She sighed with relief. Her daughter wasn't dead yet, which meant there was a faint glimmer of hope. She pulled out the cell phone from the pocket of her jeans and called 911. "911, what's your emergency?" came the response. "It's my daughter. Please come at once. Please. She tried to kill herself. She's cut her wrists. I think she's taken some pills. There's blood everywhere. I don't know what to do. I've detected a faint pulse. She's still alive. She's in a bad way. She's unresponsive." "The emergency services are on their way. Can you try and thwart the bleeding from the wrists?" came the kind, authoritative voice. But stay on the line with me, madam. Stay very calm. If you panic, you make things far worse for yourself and for your daughter. See if you can find some bandages or strips of sheet. Tie them around the wrists to stop the bleeding. It's very important to stop the bleeding. Everything began to spin out of control in Mrs. Ashbluff's head. Her thoughts a jumbled blur, a tangled chaos. And every second that went by, waiting for that ambulance to arrive, seemed to last a lifetime. Seconds felt like hours. Minutes felt like days, even weeks. Time seemed to move forward at a snail's pace. The only way that Mrs. Ashbluff could describe the turmoil she was feeling was like being thrown into a jar of jelly beans and being shaken around so violently, vigorously. Once the EMTs arrived, she could tell by the efficient way they were working on her daughter that time was of the essence. Soon she sat in the ambulance holding her daughter's hands as she was ferried to the hospital. For a second her daughter's eyes opened very briefly. "I'm sorry, Mum," her daughter managed to say. "I'm really sorry. It was the photograph. I had to do it. There was no other way." "Photograph?" said her mother. "What are you talking about, Kirsten?" But Kirsten did not respond. She had slipped back into oblivion. But Mrs. Ashbluff knew a photograph had resulted in her daughter's attempting to take her own life. She could not get her mind around this. She needed to find out exactly what was going on. She was tired of all her daughter's secrecy. If she had been more on the ball, she might have been able to have averted this disaster from ever happening. Mrs. Ashbluff believed unequivocally that she could have helped her daughter Kirsten, but not knowing what was going on in her daughter's head meant she could not be the anchor that Kirsten badly needed. Something had made her daughter become unhinged of late. Why would a photograph cause her to try and end her life? It seemed nonsensical, ridiculous, outlandish to attempt to take your own life over a photograph of all things. But Mrs. Ashbluff knew that teenagers were more predisposed to doing irrational things like this when they became overwhelmed with the issues of life, of which they were afraid that there was no escape. Let's not kid. Life can be tough at the very best of times, especially to someone as impressionable and as sensitive as Kirsten. 24 hours later, her daughter woke up in the hospital bed, surrounded by the loving members of her family. Her stomach had been pumped, and her attempts to slash her wrists had not been very successful, so she was on her way to making a full and complete recovery. She looked at her mother bashfully. "I'm so sorry, Mum." "Why, Kirsten? Why? I need to understand why you would do this. Do you know this is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me? If I lost you, I don't know what I would do with myself. Why would you do this, Kirsten? Why would you do this to yourself? Why would you do this to us?" "I just wanted to make friends, Mum, at school. I did something really silly. Everybody was sniggering at me behind my back, calling me all kinds of nasty names. I just couldn't take it anymore, Mum. It was the only way out." "Now you listen to me, Kirsten, and you listen to me hard. There's always a way out. Always. If things overwhelm you, there is an escape, but you need to talk to me. I'll always help you. Involve me in your life, for goodness sake. I'm your mother. That's what I do. That's what I'm there for. I would move hell and high water to keep you safe. But if you don't tell me what's going on, how will I ever be able to help you? I need you to promise me that you will never, ever do something like this again. We love you, Kirsten. If you weren't here, it would break my heart. You are my beautiful, beautiful girl, and I love you so much." "Mum's right," said my brother Braden. "If I didn't have you around, there wouldn't be anyone to tease. But really, sis, if you need me to fight your corner, I always will. I'll personally go and speak to anyone giving you a hard time. But don't you ever do this again." "I'm so sorry, Mum. I'm sorry, Braden. And tell Daddy I'm sorry as well. You're right. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm actually glad to still be here." Kirsten's account. In the beginning, I'd been very happy to move to the Colorado countryside, especially when I saw the exquisite farmhouse where we were going to live. I knew I would have the quintessential opportunity to own my own horse, and what in the world could be better than that? Naturally, I was desperately sad to leave behind my friends and my old school, but my mother was sufficiently confident that I would make brand new friends. The best thing about the move was rescuing Sunbeam. When I saw her dreadful condition in the newspaper, I knew I had to do something about her. I couldn't believe that a local man, not liked by many, had starved that horse half to death. When the shelter visited his farm, there were dead animals lying everywhere, carcasses and bones of neglect lying on the grass, all victims of his cruel, despicable and unkind neglect. There was an old dog chained to a metal railing, with only the ribs showing, looking like the most sorrowful sight that you have ever seen in your life. In the picture he looked exceedingly old, very frail, but I was to find out he was only a year old. I'm glad to say that the dog found a new loving home and fully recovered. I would have gladly rescued him as well. The man was a monster of the worst kind, and thank God he was arrested. The worst thing about the raid on his farm is that this man had barns and barns stashed with food. There was no need for any of the animals to have gone hungry. I think the animals were victims of his indifference and sheer laziness. If he didn't want to feed the animals, why didn't he hire a farmhand to help him out? He was not short of a bob or two. I honestly do not know why he didn't feed his animals, but I'm very glad he was arrested and charged. He's never allowed to own animals again. The shelter was about to put down poor little Sunbeam as an act of mercy, but I begged them to let me take care of him. In truth, they thought he would last only the night, but I knew in my heart he would pull through. I don't know why I knew this, but I did. I felt as if I was meant to save him. He was a young horse. He didn't deserve to have his life cut short. The moment I saw him, I connected with him. Our eyes met, and I could see a deep sadness in their depths, but I also knew he didn't want to die. "You cannot put him down. You absolutely can't," I insisted. "He doesn't want to die. I know he doesn't. And I can help him, and I will." And I did help him. And despite their doubts, Sunbeam made a full and awesome recovery. When I sent the shelter a picture of him, they couldn't believe it was the same horse. They were astonished. There was no doubt he was a remarkably good-looking horse. "You did well," the shelter told me. "He looks incredible." I might have saved Sunbeam, but in truth he saved me from the darkness that had descended over my life. That was so thick and murky, it was hard to see any light. I had never been a confident person, at the very best of times, so when I started at my brand new school, I shrank away from the people in my class, and no one made any effort to befriend me. On the contrary, people went out of their way to be terribly mean towards me, possibly because they could. I let them. I was the despised doormat that they could tread all over and snigger about. Some of the girls would call me insulting names. They'd whisper about me behind my back and giggle. The boys weren't spiteful or catty like that towards me, but they just didn't want to get involved. They turned a convenient blind eye to what was going on. It got significantly worse when a couple of the popular girls in our class began to bully me. The trouble is that when cool girls in school make fun of you, everybody follows their lead to keep in with the hip crowd, as people all want to be liked and accepted. I was a fool, as I didn't stand up for myself in the way Braden would have done. If he had been wearing my shoes, he'd have mown down those bullies in a heartbeat with his sharp words. No one would have dared upset him again. My brother would have gained respect at once. He would not put up with any nonsense, which is why it's so easy for him to make tons of friends. I've seen Braden march up to a boy once who said something mean to him, and he said, "What's your problem? Are you looking for a fight? Because if you are, don't tempt me. Believe me, friend, this is a fight that you can't win." Braden can be very assertive, so no one dares challenge him. In truth, he's a peacemaker who loathes any kind of conflict. I wasn't like Braden. I lacked his ballsy personality. Instead, I crawled further and further and further into my shell. I felt so lonely, so isolated, as nobody wanted to be my friend. But there was one girl who started to become friendly with me, but she was also one of the kids on the outside that was always being bullied. So it was obvious for the two unpopular kids in class to naturally become friends. She knew I liked one of the boys, who she believed had a secret crush on me. She suggested I should send him a topless picture of myself. At first the idea absolutely horrified me. I thought it would be a vulgar, tasteless thing to do. But it's amazing the path that desperation can lead you down. The desire to be liked and accepted, welcomed into the fold, almost consumed my life. "If he likes you," my friend had said, "you will go out together. Then everybody will like you. Then maybe you can persuade the cool kids in class to like me too. So we'll no longer be outsiders, but part of the cool group." I knew that everyone in my class liked Fletcher Kester, whom I knew had a secret crush on me. You know things like that. You feel them. He was a popular boy in school. He was handsome too, with blonde hair that seemed to dance around his honey-coloured skin in natural curly waves. He had a perfectly symmetrical face, and the bluest eyes I'd ever seen, that in some lights almost became a silver grey. He was also a star on the sports field, so if I was to become his girlfriend and hung around him, I would soon be accepted by everyone. I'd seen him giving me several shy, rather approving glances, and smiling at me a couple of times. I could see he was desperately shy, not the assertive type like my brother. But he did have a modest confidence about him. I really liked him, and I knew the feeling was mutual. There was this silent connection between the two of us that I felt from the word go. I knew he was unlikely to make the first move in asking me out, so I presumed the ball was in my court. If everybody saw him giving me attention, the bullies would go away. They'd leave me alone. They'd be silenced, and I wanted that more than anything else in the entire world. So if Fletcher received an intimate, personal picture, for his eyes only, I thought he'd know I really liked him, and then he might find the courage to ask me out. I was so tired of feeling like a fish out of water. I wanted to be welcomed at my new school, for people to naturally like me. My brother was having a roaring time at school. He was popular and had tons and tons of friends, but not me. I took the topless picture of myself in an attractive lighting. The picture looked really good, like something you might see in a glossy magazine. I was quite proud of myself for my accomplishments, but worried that I looked cheap. I felt a little uncomfortable doing what I was doing. It didn't seem natural, and seemed ridiculously silly. But as I told you, I was desperate. Looking back, it was a pathetic thing to do. I showed the picture to my friend, who encouraged me at once to send it to Fletcher. "It's fantastic! He's going to love it," she said. I sat there in the geography class, with my finger on my cell phone, plucking up the courage to send it to him. And I chickened out on numerous occasions, until finally I closed my eyes really tight and clicked the send button. I glanced over at Fletcher after I'd sent him my picture. He looked visibly shocked to receive a topless photograph of me in the middle of a geography class, when the teacher was talking about how hot the equator was. Fletcher raised his hand up rather cheekily in class, giving me a cute wink, saying, "Mrs. Lennox, there are some things way hotter than the equator, you know." "You're right about that, Fletcher," said Mrs. Lennox. "I'm glad you pointed that out. The air temperature in the tropics is 42 degrees Celsius, which is greater than the equator, which is 30 degrees. This is why the tropical regions are hotter than the equator. For example, the Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on the planet. It's located in the tropics, away from the equator. Well done, Fletcher. I'm very impressed that you made this point. It's very observant of you." In the beginning, when Fletcher had actually received my picture, his shocked reaction certainly grabbed his friend's attention. "What is it, bro?" his friend asked curiously. "Nothing," he said. Fletcher was looking up at me. He gave me a wink and a thumbs up. I was so pleased he liked my photograph. He sent me a response. "You're far hotter than the equator. I really like you. We must go out for a milkshake sometime. But you didn't need to send me your photograph. I liked you already. I'll delete it before anybody sees it." I was so happy my friend's plan was working. Then everything went so badly wrong. My heart sank. All of a sudden, my worst fears were confirmed when Fletcher's friend snatched his cell phone from him to see what was going on. He knew Fletcher had seen something interesting on his cell phone based on his reaction and wanted to see it for himself. "Give me my cell phone back," said Fletcher, running after his friend, who, on seeing the photograph, grinned like a Cheshire cat. "Oh my word, look what we got here!" He then clicked all the buttons and sent the picture to everyone in our class. All at once, everybody's cell phones were pinging, and there were shocked faces and giggles and smirks as everyone turned around to look directly at me. There were a plethora of expressions on people's faces, from disgust to pity to humour. Fletcher was mouthing to me, "I'm sorry." His face had gone a beetroot red colour. I remember going to my locker to retrieve something. I heard some of the girls sniggering about me behind my back. "I knew she was a slapper. That girl is a slapper. She sent a filthy picture of herself to Fletcher, completely topless. I mean, talk about desperate, throwing yourself at him like that. What a little tart. I can't believe she had the audacity to do such a thing. Talk about brass nerve. She ought to be standing on a street corner, selling her body," said somebody else. "Oh, she's a real hussy." "You mean she's a whore? She's a whore, that's what I say." The tears spilled down my cheeks, and they didn't stop, especially when I heard and read all the nasty things being written about me on social media. It was brutal. Thankfully, Fletcher managed to get his friend to delete the picture, but by then everybody in my class had seen it. The damage was done. I felt so humiliated. I wanted the ground to swallow me up whole. There was no way I could go back to school again, not after this. When I returned home that day, I went to say goodbye to my beautiful horse Sunbeam. I didn't want to say goodbye to him. I was very emotional. "Goodbye, Sunbeam. There's no other way. I have to leave." He nuzzled me so affectionately. I cried in his mane until it was saturated with my tears. I felt like a real coward, knowing that I was ending things, and against all the odds, Sunbeam had pulled through to fight another day, and if he could do it, so could I. I almost felt as if Sunbeam was telling me to hold on for a little longer, that everything would work itself out in the end. Part of me knew the horse was right. The truth is, the bullying online was so hurtful, I just couldn't deal with it. I'm not sure why I didn't think to write a suicide note to my parents, but it never occurred to me. I went straight to the bathroom, ran a bath, swallowed a whole bunch of pills, and began to cut my wrists. It wasn't an easy thing to do. I was scared to die, but far more afraid to live. So no one was more surprised than I was to wake up in a hospital bed, still very much alive, after my stomach had been pumped and my wounds attended to. I was unable to believe that I was actually alive, but I was pleased that I wasn't dead. It felt good to be able to tell my mother everything that had happened. She was actually very shocked that I would send a topless photograph of myself to a boy in class, just so that he might like me, and in turn persuade others to like me too. On reflection, it was a ludicrous thing for me to have to do. It made me look exceedingly desperate, but then again I was desperate, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. My brother told me I should have stood up for myself. He gave me some pointers on what I should say next time that somebody was mean to me. "You need to stand up for yourself, sis. You need to open up that mouth of yours and speak out. Otherwise people take advantage of you. They can be cruel. You can't afford to be timorous at school." "Your brother's absolutely right," my mother had told me. "Next time someone tries to belittle you, play them at their own game. If they tell you you're a slut, you turn around and say, 'Well, what are you then, when such filth comes out of your mouth? If I'm a slut, you're a public sewer, and you can't get worse than that, can you? At least a slut can clean up their act. But a public sewer, no, you can't ever clean that up. It remains filthy for generations.'" I knew my mother was right, but it was easier said than done. I spent the next month at home recuperating from my emotional turmoil and internal demons, as my therapist advised me to take a respite from school for a while. So I was doing schoolwork at home, receiving counselling from him. He came to talk to me about my suicide attempt, At first I was hesitant to talk to him about it, but he was a great listener and helped me to see that running away from life was not the answer, and that problems can easily be addressed and fixed, and there is a way out, but it's important to go to someone who will listen and help you. He encouraged me to go riding in the countryside and walking a lot in nature. I took his sagacious advice to heart. In my experience, young lady, nothing heals the raw wounds of a troubled heart more than the natural world. You can talk to the trees and the plants. They'll listen to you. Do you know everything has an energy signature on it? Even your nightstand has one, but plants and trees, they feel. If I were you, I would spend some quality time with Sunbeam, your horse. You helped him get better. I'm quite sure he wants to help you too. One day I got the surprise of my life when my mother told me I had an unexpected visitor. I was surprised to see it was Fletcher. I remember walking into the kitchen where my mother had poured Fletcher a large glass of lemonade. He was looking at me a little shyly, sitting there at the breakfast nook. My mother made her excuses and left the kitchen so that we were left together in peace. I bet you didn't expect to see me, did you? Let me tell you, it took a lot of courage for me to come and see you. But I knew I needed to see you. It hasn't been the same without you in class. You always made the class a much prettier place, if you don't mind my saying. It's good to see you. I didn't expect to see you here, Fletcher, I said, climbing into the seat of the breakfast nook opposite him, feeling ever so slightly nervous that he'd paid me this fleeting visit, while my heart was doing flip-flops. I really liked Fletcher. It was good to see him. Furthermore, he was being so charming. I felt comfortable talking to him. My shyness dissipated. I heard what you did. Much like everything at school, the news went around like wildfire. Nothing is kept secret for very long. I was devastated when I heard the news. Why did you do it? Try to kill yourself. That's insane. You've got so much to live for. It didn't feel like it at the time. Everybody was calling me a slut, a slapper, a tart, a whore. Nasty names after I sent you that photograph. Why did you send me that picture? I don't get it. I began to flush with embarrassment. It was Deborah Paniston's idea. She thought you'd like me if I sent you a topless picture of myself. Fletcher broke out into a broad grin. Oh, that's hilarious. So sending me a topless picture is going to make me like you more. I don't think so. I'm a bit deeper than that, I'd like to think, Kirsten. I may be a teenager, but I'm not shallow. If you must know, I liked you from the very beginning. You were different to the other girls. Some of them have got filthy mouths on them that need to be cleaned out with soap and salty water. You were sweet and cute from the very beginning. If you must know, I was going to pluck up the courage to actually ask you out before you sent me that photograph. Let's just say in a school like ours, full of prying busybodies, it's always a risk sending a topless picture to anyone, even if you trust someone. It's never worth the risk. I was going to delete it, but that friend of mine, as you know, grabbed it and unfortunately sent it to everyone. Now, I like Paul very much, but he can be so immature and childish at times. What he did was disgusting, but I'm glad to say he regrets it now. I'm sorry that picture got out. People can be cruel, and they said some brutal, unkind things about you, but you should never care what other people think. My grandfather taught me that a long time ago. He always said, quit caring about what other people think. It'll consume your life, and it's really not important. It's easier said than done, Fletcher, I'd said. It's hard not to care when people are being mean to you. You might not understand that, because you've always been popular. Well, I hope you're going to come back to school. I think you'll find, Kirsten, that the people's attitudes have changed significantly. I had words with everyone in class myself, and so did the headmistress for that matter. She came to the class and fed them the riot act. I've never seen so many bashful faces in all my life. What's wrong with you? She screamed. Why are you so vicious? A young girl nearly killed herself last night because of the unkindness in your hearts. If she hadn't pulled through, how many of you here today would have blood on your hands? I'm ashamed to consider some of you pupils in my school. And when that girl returns to our school, if ever I get a sniffle, if ever one of you says a single mean thing about her, I will not hesitate to get you suspended from school indefinitely. Do you hear me? Yes, yes. She said that. She did. And what did you tell the class? What did I say? Yes, what did you say? Well, I told some of the girls they needed to wash out their filthy mouths with salt and water, that they should be ashamed of their spiteful tongues. They might just rot their teeth. So they haven't been saying mean things about me anymore? Well, if they do, they'll have me to deal with as well, not just a surly headmistress, who means every word she says, let me tell you. That woman doesn't suffer fools gladly. She's livid with some of the pupils. When she gave them that speech in class, I could swear her nostrils were actually flaring. For me personally, I won't tolerate anyone saying anything bad about you. I've got your back from now on. So will you please come back to school, please? I think you'll find people will be reaching out to you. I'll think about it, I said. You do that. Give me a call if you want a milkshake in town sometime. I'd love to take you out. He paused for a moment suddenly, becoming quite shy. I really like you, Kirsten. I mean, really like you. And it has nothing to do with the picture you sent me. I'll see myself out now. When Fletcher left, I was touched to the quick. I couldn't believe how kind he'd been. I was already beginning to feel much better, and the prospect of returning to school didn't seem quite so daunting. It was almost as if the bad weather of my life had lifted, and there was a glimmer of sunshine beckoning to me. What a lovely boy, said my mother, coming into the kitchen with a warm smile. He really seems to like you a lot. What did he have to say? He was the one that I sent the topless photograph to, that got sent to everybody in the classroom. He was telling me to come back to school, that I was missed, and that he'd have my back if anyone dared say anything nasty to me. He said I should never have sent that picture to him, that he liked me already, and that he wasn't as shallow as that. This from a 16-year-old boy? My word, I am impressed. You've got a keeper there. You certainly have. He wants to have a milkshake with me in town sometime. Well, what are you waiting for, sweetheart? Get phoning him for that milkshake date. Don't just look a gift horse in the mouth. You need to make that date. Boys like him don't grow on trees, you know. I grinned happily at my mother. I'm just going to take Sunbeam for a ride, I told her. It was a beautiful day when I took Sunbeam for his ride in the countryside. Sunbeam and I were incredibly close these days. We seemed to understand each other. I knew he sensed I'd recently been through a rough time. He commiserated with me. When I walked over towards him with the reins and saddled him up, he seemed thrilled we were going for a ride together. We'd both been through the dark night of the soul together, so that sealed our bond all the more. Horses can be remarkably intuitive. He nuzzled me affectionately, staring at me through his dark, spirited eyes, with such a gentle, affectionate kindness. My father could not ride Sunbeam. Any time a man came near him, he would react with fear. My father had managed to win him around slowly and surely, but I doubted he'd ever be able to ride Sunbeam. He had been abused by that man, so it was understandable he wanted nothing more to do with men. But I was hoping he would soon see that not all men are woven from the same cloth. Before long, Sunbeam and I were galloping outside our farm, riding down a country lane, a well-known horse-riding trail. The sky was a cornflower blue. There was a splattering of fluffy clouds soaring above my head. There was a gentle wind blowing, and the trees jiggled in the breeze, while the sound of the pretty bird-song chirruped through the valley. It was just me and Sunbeam together, trotting down the country roads. It was absolutely gorgeous. Sunbeam's dark coat gleamed in the morning sun. I stroked the mane between the ears as we trotted under the radiant light of a cheerful day. I could smell wild flowers mingled with moss on the wind, and I saw a couple of bald eagles soaring above us in the sky. It felt so good to be alive. We'd been trotting for quite some time, when Sunbeam seemed to smell something on the wind that he appreciated. He seemed to like the scent, and be somewhat familiar with it. He was eager to take a left-hand turn on the hiking trail. I was intent on taking a right, but I thought, what the hell? I allowed him to dictate the ride, as he seemed doggedly determined to take that route. I'd never seen him so persistent before, so I obliged his choice. The paths along the trail became considerably more narrow, as tall, lofty trees brushed against my clothes. All of a sudden, Sunbeam stopped in his tracks, refusing to go any further, and when I tried to turn him around to go back from whence we'd come, he remained rigidly stiff and unyielding. I got the sense he was waiting for something or someone. But who? It turned out we didn't have to wait for terribly long. Sunbeam let out a neigh, and then I heard the sound of Sunbeam's own neigh, returning to him on the wind. Was there another horse in our midst, I wondered? Is that why Sunbeam had brought me here? I could hear feet crunching forest debris, and that was when I saw her. I was seated in my saddle, when this idiosyncratic creature hurried over to Sunbeam, almost oblivious to me for a brief moment. I knew at once why Sunbeam had brought me here. He wanted to see his friend. He was obviously very well acquainted with this creature. Seeing the creature up close and personal was like seeing a giant-like human being, covered in lots and lots of hair, with a pyramid-shaped head and overlong arms. I knew it was a Bigfoot. By all accounts, Sunbeam was so thrilled to see her. He was nuzzling her affectionately with his nose. She was talking to him in a strange language that sounded like an ancient dialect. Inatikana, hopokolana, ijava silo. Suddenly things made perfect sense to me. I'd often returned to the stable block to find that someone had plaited both of our horses' manes. My father thought it was me. I thought it was my father. It was a long-standing joke between the two of us as to who was the guilty party, sneakily plaiting the horses' manes. Now I knew who the mystery platter was. Until this point in time, I had been very undecided and non-committal about Bigfoot. I wasn't so cynically scathing that I didn't believe such a creature could actually exist in North America, as it's a very large place, so it wasn't beyond the bounds of impossibility. Yet if Bigfoot was real, I'd never envisaged for a single moment that one would ultimately cross my path one day. I think to Sunbeam the Bigfoot was as human to her as I probably was. I was very confounded by what I was beholding. I'm certain my mouth was hanging wide open, like a loose straw in your kitchen, and my astounded eyes were as wide as saucers. I sat there on the saddle, wondering if this was just an illusory, fantabulous dream, from which I would surely awaken. But this was no dream. In that poignant, indelible moment, the Bigfoot looked right up into my eyes, and there was a warm, stirring feeling in my heart. I was never afraid of her, not even for a transient second. You can always tell what someone's heart is like by the way they interact with other animals. The Bigfoot treated Sunbeam like a beloved friend. I'd say at a guess, she was about 8.5 foot tall, 800 pounds in weight. She was remarkably human-looking in her body shape and her facial features, although her face was exceedingly well chiselled, with defined cheekbones and an angular jawline. She had a prominent forehead that was heavily wrinkled, but her deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes were as dark as my horse's were. She had a gentle benevolence and warmth about her, but I've often found big creatures to be very kind. Everything about this Bigfoot was humongous. Her hands, her feet, her shoulders, and the Herculean dimensions of her muscular body. The Bigfoot spoke to me in her language that was immediately translated into my head, and I could understand everything she was saying. I think it was some kind of telepathic communication of some kind. Hiposha kisa fono bona, ilani sila shikasa, ho bona alinanuk, o mogola kina kata. So we finally meet. Your horse told me all about you, how you saved him. He tells me he wants to save you too. Ishokona basa, hitola balikala, ivo boshono. That's why he brought you to me. He wanted me to help you. You've lost your way a little. You need a nudge in the right direction. O boki, o nolani, hifoshola sana, o molilana. The Bigfoot seems to look at me, as if she's literally rifling through the files of my mind. Ilaki lia como, anasanasi, o pukachata katalani, No shaki sinavo. You're a beautiful soul, she told me. Why would you try to harm yourself? You are here for a reason. You have a job to do. Everyone is here for a reason. No one is here by random chance. Surely you must know that. I was gobsmacked. How do you know I tried to harm myself? I stammered. How can you possibly know that? You don't even know me. Amakina top, atila casino, akila mojanasi, ha fokolona zinalon, ijaki la guala. I can see many things that you can't, the Bigfoot told me. I know things and can read minds. You must never attempt to harm yourself again, young lady. That's a very foolish thing for you to do. Your life is a precious gift. You must remember that. You are a treasured soul that is unconditionally loved and cherished. But you don't understand. People were being mean to me, saying horrible things about me. You wouldn't know what it's like to live in my kind of world. You live in the trees. No one judges you like they judge me. But in my world, everybody judges you. You don't escape being judged. One is never good enough, thin enough, pretty enough, clever enough. One is just never enough. Mokola kitavonolak, ishogo bolagilana, ho vashwakanasa. I understand more than you know. I know many of your kind can be cruel, with hearts as cold as ice. Those that are like that are the ones that are truly lost. If someone is unkind to you, it's because they're hurting on the inside. Meanness does not come from a happy, contented person or happy, contented place. It doesn't come from someone who knows themselves either. It comes from a wounded person who doesn't know who they are. They are the ones struggling to find the light. Feel sorry for them. They deserve your pity, for they are well and truly lost. Ikaso bola jina, ho vo honak, igala ko bagasa. What they think of you is of no concern of yours. Look at me. Do I care what anybody thinks about me? Of course not. I can certainly succeed in scaring things away from me, based on my huge size and the intimidating way I look. But I'm not bothered about that. Absolutely not. You live your life in peace, and the peace will surely follow you. It always does. Peace cannot exist in conflict, any more than conflict can exist in peace. But it's always the good that will override the evil, as the light will always conquer the darkness. Don't ever forget that. O catalano, o javila gila, ho bakasala, ijovagina lona. The Bigfoot spoke some words to my horse, who seemed to understand. She nodded and watched us trotting away. She called after me again. Hiko basivo, abasivo. Remain in your peace. And she was gone. The following week I returned to school. I was determined I was going to follow the Bigfoot's advice. I was going to live in peace, and any cruel, heartless words thrown in my direction would become like water off a duck's back to me. I was surprised how many people welcomed me back in my class, and several girls actually came up to me to apologize for their former behavior towards me. I'm so glad you're back, they told me. I'm also sorry if I said anything horrible to you that might have hurt you at any time. Even though most people were kind to me, there were a couple of girls who sniggered at me. One said to me, "Pity you didn't kill yourself. You're a real slapper, sending a topless picture of yourself to Fletcher. I mean, how desperate can you get?" I straightened my back up and said, "It might be a pity to you that I'm not dead, but I for one am very glad I'm alive. If you think I'm a slapper, that's your problem, not mine. I know I'm not. If you can finally refrain from trying to talk down to me, I'd be very much obliged by that. There's a bathroom down the corridor. You might consider washing your dirty mouths out with soap and water, because from where I'm standing, they look very, very dirty." The two girls looked at me with open mouths, unable to believe that I had the guts to challenge them, and from that point on, they never belittled me again. I soon became a popular pupil at that school, and much like my brother, no one would have dared say a mean thing to me again, as for the first time in my life I stood up for myself. But I also no longer cared what anybody thought. I was determined to grab peace with both of my hands and to live each day to the fullest, and I did. To cut a long story short, I really believe that my horse Sunbeam reached out to the Bigfoot in order for me to receive some much-needed advice that changed my life. It is the same advice I give to my own children today, and believe it or not, the young boy I sent my topless picture to is now my husband, and we're very happily married. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was Christmas Eve in New York City, as Mrs. Paxman sat in the back of the pre-ordered taxi cab with her 2 sons, Paul 11 and Bobby 12, looking out the window as the taxi driver drove down Fifth Avenue. The traffic was heavy. The sidewalks were congested with excitable last-minute Christmas shoppers. The atmosphere of the twinkling city, with its sparkling, glittering Christmas lights, was electric, and with the soft light of the late afternoon, early evening, it was washed in a silvery chiffon glaze that only added to the magical ambience. You could see by the ebullient way people were walking around, their arms weighted down with their heavy bags of Christmas parcels, that the holiday buzz was contagious. People and tourists alike were glancing eagerly through shop windows, mesmerized by the cheerful, glittering window trim. Many were moving hastily towards the fabled Rockefeller Center to see the not-to-be-missed sensational Christmas tree. The pewter-coloured sky had grown grey, with clouds. The weather forecast was hinting that a white Christmas was on the cards. You could almost feel and smell the presence of snow in the air. It was cold at this time of the year, and New Yorkers were feeling the gusts of a cold breeze beating against their cheeks, as necks were buried behind heavy woolen scarves, and cold icy hands were tucked snugly into fleece-lined leather gloves, while people were wrapped up in puffer jackets and coats. Let's just say the sound of Christmas carols trinkled down the streets. The flashing, twinkling lights of Christmas trees, the glittering accessories that serenaded every shop window, had turned the early breath of the evening into a fairy tale, for there was something so magical about this time of the year. The smell of apple and cinnamon, along with baked ham, seemed to be wafting in the air from a nearby bakery, where people were queuing up to buy fabulous French breads and Christmas fare to take home for Christmas. The smells were so good. You could practically taste the gingerbread and the brandied mincemeat pies. What was there not to like about this grippingly atmospheric time of year? Mrs. Paxman was comfortably seated in the back of the taxi cab, with 1 son on either side of her. She was very afraid that her husband might not be coming home for Christmas. The thought was just too terrible for words. They had all intended to stay at the cabin that she had booked for her family, in the Adirondack Mountains, 4 hours away from Manhattan, 2 hours south of Montreal. She was crossing her fingers and toes that everything would turn out just fine. But a lingering doubt had descended across her mind like a looming black thundercloud. Her lips quivered, her fingers twitched. She found herself tapping her feet on the floor. "Stop it," she told herself. "Get a grip, woman. The children will pick up your anxiety. You can't let them see you like this." Bobby sat in the back, next to his mother, his heart heavy with anticipation. They were going to the hospital to pick up their father, but supposing the doctors did not give their father the all-clear for Christmas, then it would mean their dad would not be coming home, and Christmas would not be the same without him. The taxi would wait for them outside the hospital, and if their father did not join them, they'd be taken by their taxi to the Adirondack Mountains, to the cabin that they'd booked. But how could they possibly enjoy themselves without their father being present? Their father would be forced to spend a lonely Christmas without them, stuck in a miserable, mediocre, rather pedestrian hospital ward. Little Bobby Paxman felt a sadness wash over him as he could see the buzzing people out of the car window, chirruping happily on street corners, some with steaming cups of portable coffee or fancy lattes in their hands, caught up in the cheerful Christmas vibe. It was so incredibly unfair that Bobby did not share in their enthusiasm, that this time of the year would normally engender in him. He clandestinely decided that this was the worst Christmas of his young life. If his dad wasn't going to be with them, Christmas was a washout this year, a total washout. It was so unfair, so unfair, he thought to himself, as tears impertinently bounced out of his eyes and rolled slowly down his cheeks, which he hurriedly wiped away with the back of his sleeve, so his mother couldn't see them. What was the matter with him? Big boys didn't cry. "Pull yourself together, Bobby Paxman," he told himself. Mrs. Paxman could see the lugubrious, sorrowful melancholia on her children's faces. She could see how rigid they were, as they sat there in the back seats so stiffly, like two china dolls, almost immune to the cheerful atmosphere of Christmas, like a great big unyielding brick wall. In truth, she knew her crestfallen children were devastated that their dad might not be joining them for Christmas, depending on what Dr. MacFryer had to say. But that doctor was so predictable. She could see him now looking at her through his round glasses that framed his grave, steely eyes, and shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Paxman, but until we've got to the bottom of what is going on with your husband, we simply cannot discharge him." He had said this to her over the last few weeks, again and again, and they were making absolutely no progress in uncovering the enigmatic cause of her husband's baffling illness, despite countless scans, blood tests, and goodness knows what else. Mrs. Paxman's husband had complained of sharp shooting pains in his chest, dizziness, disorientation, fainting spasms, nausea, unexplained weight loss. He had confounded the medical establishment, and no one knew what was going on with him, which was why he'd been kept indefinitely at the hospital, as his rapidly declining health was a cause of grievous concern. For if he continued down this precarious downward trajectory, the prognosis long-term did not look good. Mrs. Paxman had feared the very worst, wondering if her husband had some kind of cancer, but all the tests had come back clear, which meant that some ambiguous, incomprehensible condition was stealing her husband's health with a furtive cunning that had outfoxed all his doctors. Ron Tucker, the taxi driver, seated in the driver's seat, was driving the family to the Adirondack Mountains. Mrs. Paxman had told him to make a swift stop at the hospital to collect the children's father, if the doctor gave him permission to leave the hospital for a few days. Ron glanced very discreetly at the two boys in the back of the taxi, studying their long faces in the visor mirror. They had dark circles under their eyes. His heart went out to them. No kids should look this woebegone and downcast over Christmas. This was his last job of the season, which coincided beautifully with joining his own family at Christmas, whom were all staying in the Adirondack Mountains at his mother's farmhouse. In effect, he was killing two birds with one stone, acquiring this very opportune last-minute job. Ron had two sons at home of similar ages to the two young boys sitting in the back, and when he'd last spoken to them, they had sounded so excited about Christmas. "Dad, when are you coming home?" they had chirruped excitedly. "I've got one more trip to do," he told them. "I'll be seeing you all in time for Christmas morning." "Don't be long, Daddy. Granny's made the best eggnog ever. It's non-alcoholic. It's amazing. It's yummy. And guess what? We've iced the gingerbread house. It looks amazing. We've decorated the Christmas tree in the parlour, and Granny's farmhouse looks fabulous. We've hung our stockings on the mantel and put all the presents under the tree. I've been feeling all the presents, Dad, and I think I know what you and Mum bought me." "Well, you can tell me all about that when I get back. Now can I speak to your mother, please?" "Hello, sweetheart. As you can hear, the kids are very enthusiastic about you. They're so excited about you coming home. I can't wait to see you myself. It's been snowing here. I know we're going to wake up to a white winter wonderland. It's going to be perfect for Christmas Day. I love a white Christmas. So where are you now at the moment?" "I'm at the hospital at the moment. I'm taking a family to the Adirondack Mountains. They're just checking to see if their father from the hospital can be checked out. So in effect, I'm on my way to you. The job is an added bonus, Brilliant! Well, drive safely, as I'm sure with the snow expected, it could get treacherous out there. Ron Tucker leans forward in his cab, and his long, slender hands fiddle around with the radio control. Should he put on some Christmas music for these children to listen to? Will it make them feel worse if they hear cheerful, upbeat songs being played? He decided to put on some Christmas carols, but when he glances at the children's faces through the visor mirror, the upbeat, happy music has not lifted the children out of their desolate sadness. They seem pretty convinced their father is not coming home for Christmas, he thinks to himself. As he drives towards the New York Presbyterian Hospital, the mood in his taxi is so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. He can sense the worried atmosphere, which is more apparent to him than the rather tasteless glittering Christmas angel hanging now on his visor mirror. It's Christmas, he thinks to himself, and this low-spirited family is so cast down, so despondent. I wish I could do something to help them, but I'm not God. If he did have any clout with God, he'd give him a big poke in the shoulders and say, "Do something, bro! Fix this mess up! The kids, they need their father!" But Ron knows his relationship with God has been on tenterhooks of late. He can't remember the last time he prayed to the Father, apart from when he wanted the traffic congestion to stop. And when he had prayed, he'd almost thrown his fists up in the air in a tantrum. He had been raging so much. Hardly something that would endear him to his Father in heaven or give him a front row seat to his favour, that was for sure. Finally, Mrs. Paxman's voice breaks the silence. She turns around to address her two children. She hates having this conversation, especially at this time of the year, but it has to be done. She needs to prepare them for disappointment, which she can taste in her mouth as clearly as the bitter coffee she had not enjoyed earlier this morning. It was funny how everything tasted bitter ever since her husband was taken into hospital. She grimaces and bites her quivering lips as she tries to appear nonchalant. The last thing she wants her children to know is how desperately worried she is about their father. Over the last few weeks his health had really gone down rapidly. She had overheard nurses whispering in the hospital corridors that her husband must have some kind of cancer, even if the tests had all come back negative. Something's going on with Mr. Paxman. But get this, the doctors are vexed. You mark my words, it's cancer. It's got to be. The man is clearly dying. I know a dying patient when I see one. She had winced like a trapped animal, ensnared in a hunter's trap, when she heard what the medical professionals rarely thought about her husband, and it confirmed her worst fears. She also believed her husband was dying, but she'd fight tooth and nail to get him to come to the cabin for Christmas, as he was well enough to travel, not for much longer. This could be his last Christmas, she thought, fighting back a tear that was threatening to spill down her cheeks. You must not cry, she told herself, under any circumstances, as if disciplining an insubordinate child. You cannot let your children see you upset. You hear me, girl? Pull yourself together. Now, we don't know if Daddy is coming home for Christmas or not. It depends what the doctor tells us. I need to warn you that he might not discharge your father if he thinks your dad is too weak to travel. What I'm telling you is, don't get your hopes up. Bobby pulls a face, while his brother remains stoically still, his ashen face desperately trying to hide the sense of panic that is bubbling up inside him. A Christmas without their dad was a dreadful prospect. Mrs. Paxman squeezes her children's hands, both of them sitting on either side of her. I see no reason why the doctor will not discharge your father. Let's not be defeatist about it until we know what's going on. But I can promise you one thing. I will not leave this hospital tonight without a fight. I'll do my level best to try and persuade the doctor to discharge your dad for a few days. I don't see why they should refuse me. I don't like that, Mr. MacFryer. He's mean to Daddy. If he won't discharge Daddy, he's really horrible. Then he's got no Christmas spirit whatsoever. When Ron parks his taxi outside the hospital and watches the elegant woman with her two sons climbing out of the taxi, his heart almost sinks like a rock being plunged into a deep lake. His heart is bleeding for this family. He can see by Mrs. Paxman's fatigued face and the pinched hollows of her cheeks that this woman has been through hell and back, surfing the waves of despair and hopelessness. He cannot imagine what the family must be going through. He wondered how he'd feel if the doctors could not diagnose his wife. It would drive him completely insane. Mrs. Paxman managed a watery smile that doesn't meet her sorrowful eyes, that are wearing the dark shadows of a sleepless night. She leans inside the taxi to address Ron. "I'm sorry for the hold-up. We won't be very long. I'm just going to check up on my husband, see if he's well enough to come to the cabin. We shouldn't be long. I hope, at least. The doctor needs to talk to us." "You take your time, Mrs. Paxman. There's no rush, and good luck. I hope the doctor will release your husband, but I'll be waiting here for you when you return." Ron watches the family of 3, trailing into the hospital, with reluctant footsteps that tell it all. Their shoulders are hunched, their faces white, and to his surprise a lonely tear slips down his cheek, taking him off guard. "Where did that come from?" he wondered. "Men like me, we don't cry." She doesn't believe her husband is going to be released, he thinks. Poor woman. It seems nonsensical that they haven't been able to figure out what is wrong with the man. Ron found himself praying for the family. "Please, God, I realise I'm not a model worshipper. I wish I was, but I'm not like that, I'm afraid. But I have a hell of a lot of faults, I know I do, and I am a sinner. But please let the Paxman children's father come out of hospital for a few days. I beg you. I'm sure the mountain air won't kill him. On the contrary, it might do him the world of good." Ron realised he was trying to persuade God in his prayer to give the family a break, and he found his prayer became almost defiant and angry. "I think I'm angry with God," he told himself. Ron had waited patiently in the taxi, fearing the very worst for the young Paxman family. He was certain they would return to the taxi without their father, but he couldn't have been more wrong about that. Maybe the good Lord had answered his prayer after all. Mrs. Paxman is wheeling her husband towards the taxi in his wheelchair. Ron admits to himself that he doesn't look well. He's emaciated and very frail, more like a man in his 80s than a young man in his 30s. The 2 Paxman boys are standing on either side of the wheelchair, holding the bars. Their feet have almost become like Michael Jackson's dance shoes, as they appear to be skipping. Their former lugubrious expressions have been abandoned, replaced by the biggest smiles he's ever seen. If he didn't know any better, he'd think these children were not the same kids that had been sitting in the taxi only moments before. Mrs. Paxman is wearing a broad grin on her face. She keeps leaning forward in the wheelchair to brush her husband's shoulders and give her husband a reassuring nudge. Ron is sure he's seeing an expression of relief washing over Mr. Paxman's face. "Poor man," he thinks. "I imagine he's been poked and prodded within an inch of his life from some of the hospital's illustrious doctors, all who cannot agree on what is wrong with the young man." Once the family reaches the taxi, Ron jumps out of it and helps the heavily sedated Mr. Paxman into the front seat next to him, folding away the wheelchair and tucking it in the back of the trunk. Before long they're on the road, driving away from the hospital to their destination in the Adirondack Mountains, and Ron feels almost as relieved as the 2 children in the back of the taxi, as he's so pleased that Mr. Paxman will be spending Christmas with his family. He glances at the languid, chronically ill man sitting next to him, who looks like a walking corpse. He draws in a deep breath, and is impelled to pray again. "God," he says under his breath, "show your mercy to the Paxman family. Give Mr. Paxman a miracle this Christmas. By Jove, he needs one." "I don't understand," said Mr. Paxman. "How did you get the doctor to sign the discharge form for me? I thought that Dr. MacFryer would insist I spent a miserable Christmas in hospital, being prodded around and living on hospital slop, feeling as bored as hell, while they decide what they think is going on with me." "I simply told him that enough was enough, that you were in a stable condition. Although you weren't getting better, you weren't getting worse, that it would benefit you to get some fresh mountain air. If they couldn't diagnose your mysterious illness, then they weren't doing their jobs properly. Actually, I'm not sure what I said, but in the end the doctor relented. He said I was absolutely right, that it wouldn't do you any harm to go away for a few days, and in his experience going away might actually boost your morale. He said we should just keep you on your current meds, keep you comfortable and manage your pain, and bring you back to hospital in a week's time for further investigative tests. More tests, Mr. Paxman groaned. Oh, I can't tell you how many of those I've had. Anyway, let's not talk about bloody hospitals. Let's talk about Christmas, shall we? So tell me about this cabin you booked in the Adirondack Mountains. It sounds quite intriguing. Yes, Mummy, tell us about the cabin, her two boys spouted excitedly. Well, you know old Mrs. Wensleydale, the old woman I told you about. I seem to remember you mentioning her, said Mr. Paxman. She was involved with your school lift club when you were a child, am I not right? That's right. I haven't seen the woman in such an age. She was always bosom buddies with my mother, you know. She used to pick me up from school when I was a girl. I was sitting in a coffee shop about 6 weeks ago, and there she was. Of course she had changed. A full head of white hair, stylish cut around her angular face, twinkling blue eyes, and a very elegant appearance. She was always very elegant. She's always been well presented, you know, dressing in classical tweed skirts and jackets. You know the kind of thing. Well, she trotted over to me and said, "Excuse me for staring, dear, but you do look awfully familiar. I hate it when I see a face and I can't put a name to it. Where do I know you from? Could you put me out of my misery? Because I'm really suffering here. And if I hate anything, it's not getting to the bottom of a mystery. I know we've crossed paths before, but I cannot think where or when." You also look familiar, but I honestly can't think what it is. Maybe it's your eyes, your jawline, I'm not sure. My name is Irma Paxman, if that rings any bells for you. She shrugged her shoulders. I don't know any Paxmans, but I do remember an Irma. You're not Irma Thornfield, are you? I was her, before I married my husband, of course. I'm now Paxman, but I was Thornfield. Oh, my word, dear, that is good news. Don't you remember me? Silly me. I've probably aged so much over the years that you barely recognise me. I'm Mrs. Wensleydale. Do you remember? I was very good friends with your mother. I used to pick you up from school when you were a little girl. Oh, those were the days, weren't they? You were such a chatty little thing in my lift club, garrulously talking away about everything. You were quite the pleasure to collect from school. Most of the kids weren't like you. They never told us anything. Nothing about their day at all. But you would tell us everything. You were quite delightful. Oh, my goodness, Mrs. Wensleydale, I recognise you. Yes, I'm sorry it's been so long. Well, you've grown up, haven't you, into a fine, very remarkable young woman. I knew you would. May I be so bold and presumptuous to ask you if you'd be free to join me for some coffee? I'd love to catch up with you. That would be wonderful, I said. So we got talking. I told her everything. I told her about your dad being in hospital with a mysterious illness which the doctors could not diagnose. She was naturally very appalled. You mean he's only 35 and they don't know what's wrong with him? Honestly, I'm quite confounded about that. And I thought medicine had advanced these days. That really does suck. You know, I had a good friend like that, whom the doctors failed to diagnose, until they seemed to agree that she had Lyme's disease of all things. She was sick for an incredibly long period of time. It took them an age to get a diagnosis. I mean, we're talking about months, not just weeks. I think she's a lot better these days. So tell me, is your husband coming out of hospital for Christmas, I hope? I hope so, I said. Normally we go away for Christmas every year, but everything's so booked up at the moment. We're possibly going to have to stay in our Manhattan apartment. No, that absolutely will not do. Now I've got the perfect place for you, says Mrs. Wensleydale. My daughter has some luxury cabins in the Adirondack Mountains, not too far from here. They're quite stunning, and I mean stunning. I went to stay there once and I wallowed in the lap of luxury. She had kitted those cabins out luxuriously, thought of everything you could possibly think of. She told me she had a cancellation on one of the cabins, fully paid up. The couple chose to go to their family in Florida for Christmas at the very last minute. They suddenly changed their itinerary. So I hasten to say, there is one cabin going free, and it's all yours if you want it. I can give her a call if you like. It's only 4 hours away from Manhattan. Terribly convenient location-wise. Still New York. The views, oh my word, they're sensational. The cabins are magnificently, perfectly kitted out, with a freezer and refrigerator simply packed with Christmas food. So you don't even have to go food shopping for a single thing. Everything you could possibly think of is there, from your Christmas crackers to the pre-decorated Christmas tree. But you will need to do cooking on the big day, of course. The previous guests, as I said, paid for the cabin in advance, so we won't charge you a bean. So don't you dare look a gift horse in the mouth. Free Christmas cabins with all expenses paid don't grow on trees. Believe me, I know. It sounds wonderful, but how can I possibly accept that? I mean, that's just incredibly generous. But I do enjoy doing the Christmas cooking, so I won't be complaining about that. Don't talk nonsense, dear. Your family has been through hell. You deserve some good luck for a change. So you are interested, I take it. Absolutely. If you're sure, I'd love to take you up on your offer. If the cabin is available, of course, unless your daughter's given it to someone else. I doubt that very much, says Mrs. Wensleydale, pulling out her elegant leather bag, placing it on the table. She brought out her cell phone and called her daughter. Krista, it's me. Yes, your mother. You remember you told me one of the cabins was going free for the holidays? Is it still available? Oh, good, I thought so. No, I'm phoning, as by random chance I bumped into a very good old friend of ours. You might remember her. She was in your lift club at school a couple of years ahead of you, I think. Irma Thornfield, the girl that liked to talk a lot. That's right. When Mrs. Wensleydale finished talking to her daughter, she said, My daughter says she could never ever forget you. She sends you so much love. The good news is the cabin is available for you and your family. They're usually booked months in advance, you know. They don't even advertise on the internet. People learn about the cabins from friends and the word gets out like wildfire. So there you are. Now you know how I got us a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains. Well, you did well, sweetheart. With these extraordinary hospital fees, we could do well with some free accommodation. What a stroke of luck. I know a break to the mountains is what the doctor ordered. Not literally, of course. I'm already feeling a lot perkier, just getting away from that nondescript beige environment. But I feel quite woozy. They sedated me rather heavily. Good. I think that's a good thing that they did that. It possibly will make the trip more comfortable for you. Try and get some sleep, will you? As Ron drove his taxi through the night, he was familiar where he was going, for he had made the journey to this part of the world regularly, and was well acquainted with all the secondary roads here, so he knew he was unlikely to get lost. He glanced at the clock. It was 6 o'clock. If they made good timing, they could be at their destination by 10:30, if the traffic was good. The world beyond his window was dark, but the silvery light of the moon reduced its intimidation exponentially. It began to snow, as large flecks of white dropped from the sky, like floating butterflies, laying their flecks on the ground, one on top of the other. Bobby knew that once they woke up in the cabin on Christmas morning, there'd be snow everywhere. He was happy about that. He always felt desperately sorry for folks living in hot countries around the world at Christmas time, because it was the time of the year that demanded cold weather as a prerequisite for that cosy atmosphere that only winter could orchestrate. Crackling fires, piping hot Christmas turkey, crispy potatoes, and Christmas pudding served with oodles of brandy custard. When they had got into the taxi and driven to the hospital, Bobby had been certain their father would not be joining them for Christmas, and had been fully prepared to be bitterly disappointed. It had worried Bobby that something was dreadfully wrong with his father, and he was as frustrated as his mother was that the doctors were not able to diagnose his father's unfathomable foligonous condition. Bobby thought his father looked weak, very frail, and his dramatic weight loss was seriously worrying. The good news was that their dad would be joining them. It was a dream come true, he thought, given the hospital's rigidly stiff policies. But there was a nagging feeling that tormented little Bobby, tangling his guts into a plethora of knots. It was an elephant in the room he was afraid to discuss. Bobby could not shake the ominous, nonsensical feeling off, that this may well be the last Christmas they might get to enjoy with their father. He grimaced secretly, scolding himself for such defeatist, gloom-ridden musings. "Don't think like that, Bobby. Stop being so pessimistic. Your dad is here now. That's all that matters. You're going to have a wonderful Christmas with your father. Don't think about tomorrow. Think of today and cherish what time you have left with your dad, even if it is only fleeting." Bobby wondered if Paul and his mother nursed similar fatalistic, unfavourable opinions that he daren't articulate, as the monumental words could bring the world as they knew it crashing down. There was no doubt in his mind that ignorance was not bliss. Being uninformed was literally torture, and it's the not knowing that the seeds of nightmares can be propagated, and the ground can bring forth unexpected barbs, briars, and weeds that may catch you unaware and strike you down with their fortuitous cutting jabs. Even if he knew his father had a deadly cancer, at least they would know where they were. But being clueless about their dad's condition meant the whole family was stumbling around in the darkness, looking for the light and failing to ever find it. "Are you all right, Bobby?" his mother whispered to him in the back of the taxi, giving his hands a tight, encouraging squeeze. "What are you thinking about? You look as if you're miles away." "I'm glad Daddy is spending Christmas with us, that's all," said Bobby. "Really glad." "So am I," whispered his mother. "We're going to enjoy every minute, aren't we? We're going to make this the best Christmas ever. The good news is the cabin is filled with all the Christmas trimmings, and so all I need to do is the cooking in the morning. Isn't that wonderful? Everything is prepared for us." "It is," said Bobby. "It really is. And you're a great cook, Mum." Bobby had been falling asleep in the taxi. It was a comforting sound of the wheels humming across the winding roads and the sense of the snow falling soundlessly on the ground outside the taxi. But the more snow that began to fall, the more banging and buckling sounds could be heard around the taxi, as if a piston was going to come through the hood of the car. Ironically, the jerking, rocking movements of the taxi seemed to bring on the yawns, and an insatiable tiredness that meant that Bobby's eyelids began to become heavy. He surrendered to the serene persuasion of a fitful sleep. It helped that they were covered in blankets while listening to the sounds of Christmas carols, trilling through the night. Occasionally he would smudge his nose against the cold misty pane of the window and peer outside. There were no trucks on the road anymore. They had left the busy traffic behind them. There was snow on the sides of the road. The trees looked so dark, their tall, tenebrous silhouettes all but a murky shadow in the background. Bobby awoke with a start. His mother had just nudged him in the shoulders. "Get up, Bobby. We're here. Will you help your brother bring the luggage in from the trunk? I'm going to help get your dad from the wheelchair into the cabin. He needs to be tucked up into bed at once. It's been a long journey for him." "Sure," says Bobby, when he heard his mother's voice. He had been startled out of his sleep and was momentarily disorientated. Then he remembered where he was. They had arrived at the cabin. The lights of the taxi and the ethereal slivers of moonlight cast soft shadows over a glorious-looking Swiss-style cabin, with a cosy wraparound porch. Bobby climbed out of the truck, greeted by the icy blizzards of cold air that nipped against his neck, so he tightened his scarf around himself, put on his windbreaker, and pulled on his leather gloves. The snow was a couple of inches deep, and it had dappled the roof of the cabin, so it looked like a gingerbread house in the snow. Very quaint, very twee. The taxi driver helped their mother unload their father and their luggage, and wished them a Merry Christmas. "If you need anything, Mrs. Paxman, I'm not far from you at all. I can come at once. So if you have any problems with that husband of yours, I'd like to help if I may." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Tucker. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for delivering us so safely to the cabin. You're an exemplary driver. Some of those conditions on the roads were hazardous. I wouldn't have liked to have been driving in them myself."
"It's only a pleasure, Mrs. Paxman. May I take this opportunity to wish you and your family a very happy Christmas?" He pauses for a moment. "I hope that your husband will be feeling a lot better in the morning."
"Thank you. That's so kind of you. And please do send my regards to your family. Wish them the very best for the Christmas season. And happy holidays as well."
"Will do so, Mrs. Paxman."
What a nice man, she thought. The cabin was in darkness when they entered. Bobby's mother only put a few lamps on around it. From what Bobby could see, it was luxurious. The boys did not need to be persuaded to go to sleep. They were dropping with exhaustion, after a long day of being fraught with worry, anticipation, hope, and all kinds of messed up thoughts in between. So Bobby did not engage any hesitancy. When he found his way to the bedroom, which he was to share with his brother, his tired little body slipped behind Egyptian cotton sheets, covered with a warm duvet, and some light blankets. Soon he was caught up in the illusory, fantastical world of dreams. Dreams he was unlikely to ever remember, as he barely ever recalled any of them. When Bobby woke up the following morning, he sat up for a brief second, slipped his little feet into his fleece-lined slippers, and trotted over to the cabin window of his bedroom, peeking through a little gap that he'd made in the drawn curtains. He gasped in delight. He could see the world was swathed in white. He purred like an appreciative Cheshire cat, whose owner has given him a double portion of cream. It was transfixing out there. The Adirondack Mountains climbed up into the sky, like a sculptural staircase, with a magisterial repose and an ascending grace. The sprawling pine trees, bedecked with white Christmas baubles, made from the malleable hands of nature herself, were designed to mark this indelible occasion. They glistened and twinkled under the soft ethereal light, with a celebratory festive swagger, washing everything in an enchanting illumination that was reminiscent of a fairy tale. Bobby could smell the delicious savoury scents of Christmas permeate the cabin, seeping under the door of the bedroom. He could hear the bell-like trinkles of Christmas carols being played in the background on some kind of musical system. Bobby ran over to his brother, shaking the crumpled heap that resembled an inverted comma in the bed. "Wake up! It's Christmas, bro!" His dazed brother twitched for a moment and stared at Bobby through wide, earnest eyes. "I dreamt Daddy was spending Christmas with us. Please don't tell me it's a dream." "It's not!" said Bobby, grinning from ear to ear. "Don't you remember we picked Daddy up from the hospital yesterday? He's here with us. Don't tell me you've forgotten already." Bobby watched his brother's face light up into a bright, jubilant smile. "Daddy's here with us," he said happily. "Yes, he is." The two boys hurriedly dressed into their jeans and sweatshirts and dashed into the kitchen, like two unbridled puppy dogs with a hyped-up, spirited energy. Their mother was bustling away contentedly, rather industriously, in the small state-of-the-art kitchen, singing joyfully to herself what sounded to be the Christmas carol Silent Night. She had clearly been working hard. She had parboiled the fluffy potatoes that were now sitting in the piping hot fat. She opened the oven to bring out the crisp golden turkey, covered in streaky bacon, that had been cooking for over 3 hours already. She was basting it with the fat. She looked up at the two boys when they entered the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and rushing over to them, throwing her arms around them enthusiastically. Happy Christmas, sweethearts! Isn't it wonderful? Look how white it is out there! This is going to be such a magical Christmas. Happy Christmas, Mummy! I think it's going to be a very special Christmas for the 4 of us, don't you? After Mrs. Paxman had given her sons a Danish pastry each and some hot chocolate for breakfast, she said, "How about you boys go outside now? It's so beautiful out there, with everything carpeted in snow. You could go tobogganing or exploring. I'll get the food ready for lunch and the fire going in the hearth. When you come in before lunchtime, we'll open your presents in front of your father. We're going to make this one hell of a special Christmas, one we won't forget in a hurry," she said, staring at them through misty eyes that threatened to cry. Mrs. Paxman had seen how sickly her husband was. When she had tucked him into bed last night, he was in a bad way. For a moment she almost regretted bringing him to the cabin. Maybe it hadn't been the wisest idea after all. What if his condition worsened? Mrs. Paxman had slept restlessly on Christmas Eve, as a tormenting thought badgered her heart with a nagging whisper. Last Christmas, last Christmas, last Christmas for your husband. Stop it! She screamed back in her mind. Stop it! It's not true! Mrs. Paxman in the end had decided to get up really early to distract herself with the preparation of the Christmas meal. She smiled warmly at her kids, trying her best to look positive and upbeat. She was determined to make this a memorable Christmas come what may. She refused to allow a defeatist attitude to rob the day of its joy. Go on, will you? She said to her children, smiling brightly. Out into the snow. Make sure you're wearing your scarves, gloves and your woolly hats. You don't want to get cold, do you? Bobby didn't need any encouragement to go exploring, nor did his brother Paul for that matter. He paused for a brief moment to say, How is Dad? Should we not go to see him to wish him Happy Christmas? No, not now, sweetheart. Let him rest a little more, will you? He's tired after the trip yesterday, and I've given him some pain meds. But I promise you by lunchtime he'd love to watch you open your stockings and presents, but leave him be for the moment. Before long, Bobby and his brother were walking across the snow, where several inches had fallen overnight. It was luxuriously thick, absolutely perfect. Their boots left a long trail of deep indentations in the serene white oasis. They ambled inquisitively towards the sprawling woodgrove that seemed to know it was Christmas. The trees stood lofty, proud and tall, their needled boughs adorned in white pearly wedding gowns. They were like a plethora of brides gathered together in a large congregation on their wedding day. Bobby couldn't help but think. Happy Christmas, bro, said Bobby to his brother. I don't think I actually said Happy Christmas properly to you. Happy Christmas, said his brother, giving him a cheesy grin. This place is amazing. The cabin is so magical, like something out of a fairy tale. Bobby had agreed. He'd never appreciated a cabin could be as lovely as this. Laughing and giggling, the two young boys chased each other ebulliently through the snow, throwing snowballs without restraint. The signature of their boots was written over every white patch of snow, but would likely soon be expunged by the snow that was predicted to fall later, extinguishing any signs that they had been there at all. The boys had unintentionally scared off a couple of deer that were scampering away, but then they stopped, stood very still, watching the boys from a distance, their looks a curious inquiry. I wish we had some apples for them. They must be so hungry. How hard it is to eat food covered in snow. The food is probably frozen up. It's like they have to eat popsicles in the cold. Pine-flavoured popsicles, I imagine. I think we do have some apples, said Bobby. I saw a huge box in the store cupboard there. We can throw some out under the trees for them to eat. I just feel sorry for them, stuck out in the cold. It's got to be really tough. Bobby agreed. I tell you what, when we get back to the cabin, we'll definitely do that. We'll throw some apples out for them. The two boys decided to build a snowman with stones for eyes, a twig for a nose, and some tiny pebbles for a wide mouth. It would have been so much better to have a carrot for the nose, Bobby had thought. But he didn't want to go back to the cabin to interrupt his mother's cooking. She was so focused on the job in hand, making an incredible spread for them, and there was nothing worse for a cook than to be rudely interrupted. Things could burn and go awry with inconvenient distractions. The morning seemed to go by fast, and when they entered the woodgrove, Bobby stopped short in his tracks. He had the strong impression that something was watching them. He was almost certain he'd seen a head peering at him from behind a tree. He looked at his brother, who didn't seem to have picked up on the rather unsettling, bewildering vibe. Something is watching us, Bobby whispered to himself. I'm sure of it. In the distance he could hear cheerful laughter, shrill cries and screams. He saw some teenagers running around in the snow, outside another cabin, throwing snowballs at each other, shrieking and screaming loudly. He counted 5 of them, 2 boys and 3 girls, between the ages of 18 and 20. Thank goodness their cabin was well away from theirs, he thought. They were annoyingly loud. The 2 boys turned around to make their way back to the cabin, when Bobby's eyes were caught by some reflectant twinkling light.
Then he saw it, dangling from the bough of a tree. But what was it? "What is this?" he said, reaching out to untie it and taking it down to examine it. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. It was a necklace of some kind, with a leather thong, covered in carved leaves. The carvings had been made from animal bones, and in between the leaves were 3 prominent eagle feathers. The necklace looked like an ancient Indian indigenous piece of jewelry or artifact that a great Indian chief might have worn around their neck as a lucky amulet. "It's magnificent," said Bobby, examining the leaves more carefully. "Someone has carved these so beautifully. Finders keepers," he said proudly. They both examined the necklace, wondering what it could mean. It looked symbolic. When you touched it, Bobby described it as surprisingly warm, which was exceedingly weird, as it was freezing out there, with a biting wind whisking through the trees, burning their cheeks with its frosty kisses. Bobby had decided he'd wrap up this interesting amulet, giving it to his father for Christmas. It was so much more exciting as a gift than the colourful reindeer Christmas socks he'd brought his dad with the pocket money he'd saved. When the children arrived back at the cabin, the delicious savoury smells of turkey, glazed ham and bacon wafted in the air, as well as the fruity smells of cranberry sauce and apple and cinnamon. Bobby's stomach growled hungrily when the smells permeated his nostrils. There was an exquisite crackling fire in the hearth, where the flames crackled and popped. To the left-hand side of the fireplace was a huge Christmas tree that was covered in bright flashing twinkling lights, colourful wooden ornaments, silver and gold baubles, red bows, and a bright golden shiny star twinkled at the top of the tree. Their father sat on an upholstered chair by the fire, with a glass of eggnog in his hands, managing a smile for his children, but he looked washed out, peaky, pale and very sickly. Bobby noticed his father's eyes were like sunken hollows, his cheeks gaunt, his skin seemed almost tight over his skull.
"Happy, happy Christmas, kids," he said. "What are you waiting for? Go on, open up your Christmas presents and stockings,"
he said, smiling at them cheekily. Bobby and his brothers pulled the stockings, brimming over with presents from the mantel, with a zealous enthusiasm. As usual, there was an orange parked in the toe, but their stockings were filled with all kinds of delights, from chocolates to toy vintage cars, blowing bubbles, notebooks, marbles, magic tricks, and playing cards. The kids then gravitated towards their main presents, shredding everything apart with delight, so that the floor was ultimately lined with Christmas wrapper. But the most exciting moment of all for Bobby was when his father opened the present that he had for him, that he'd found in the woodgrove only moments before, which he'd wrapped up at the very last minute. "Daddy, are you going to open it?"
"This looks very intriguing,"
said his father, shaking the package. This was something the family always did before they opened a present. It was customary to try and guess what was inside. "Well, what is it, Daddy?" asked Bobby. "Guess. I bet you won't ever get it in a million years."
"It feels like something hard and flat. I'm not sure what it could be, Bobby. I am flummoxed."
"I'm not saying anything," said Bobby stoutly, as he watched his father tear open the package, his hand so thin you could see every vein.
"Where did you get this, Bobby?"
asked his father, staring in awe at the carved leaves of the necklace and the feathers.
"It looks like these leaves are made from animal bones. They've been carved, but whoever has carved them has done a masterful job. This is very, very stunning. It looks like something an Indian warrior might have worn. I really like it, Bobby. I really do. It's the most unusual present I've ever received. Thank you very much."
Bobby did not want to tell his father he'd found it in the woodgrove, but was delighted when his father put on the necklace.
"I'm going to wear it, Bobby, all through Christmas. I don't want to ever take it off."
When Bobby was to reflect back on that Christmas, everything changed after his father put on that necklace. Within 20 minutes, Bobby's father was claiming he was ravenously hungry. The family was astonished when he bolted down 2 large plates of Christmas dinner. Their father had lost his appetite in hospital, but now he was stuffing his food down like a half-starved dog,
or like those young men in hot dog eating contests when they cram their mouths full of food. Mrs. Paxman was nonplussed. She looked at her husband with eyes as wide as saucers, and a mouth so loose on her, you could have been forgiven for thinking that it would fall off its hinges, like a loose straw, and come crashing down to the ground. Stranger still, their father was cracking jokes as if it was nobody's business, while they pulled their Christmas crackers. He roared with laughter, and seemed to find everything hilariously funny. His laughter was so infectious and so contagious that everybody was laughing, not really knowing why they were laughing so much. It was like the energy their father had lost over the last few weeks had come rushing back, like an obstreperous waterfall, blasting over the rocks, without restraint. Bobby overheard his mother talking on her cell phone to her sister Megan.
"No, I promise you it's absolutely true, Megan. It's like I've got my husband back. I don't understand what's going on. He hasn't complained of any pain whatsoever. He's cracking jokes all the time, eating like a horse. And we went for a walk in the woodgrove. He could not walk yesterday. He was so weak. He had to go to the car in a wheelchair. He's now bouncing around the house like Tigger in the Wind of the Willows. And I'm not joking either. If you ask me, Erica, your husband needed this Christmas break, and being with the family has made him well again." When Erica Paxman got off the phone, her brow creased with furrows that any beautician would have insisted needed to be ironed out with plenty of Botox. What had happened to her husband, she wondered? He was so much like his old self again. Then her heart sank when she remembered an old friend of hers, who was a nurse, telling her that people can make almost a miraculous recovery before they die. "It's called the golden hour," she had told her. Mrs. Paxman grimaced. Is that why her husband was so well? Was he dying, she wondered? Mrs. Paxman's husband told her he was feeling so much better. "I haven't felt so good in such a long time. I don't remember the last time I felt this good. I don't need any pain meds. I've got my appetite back. And I think we should go for another walk. I'm champing at the bit to go out."
She could see colour in his cheeks, a sparkle in his eyes, an energy in him that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. This was like a Christmas miracle. Please God, may his good health continue, she told herself, closing her eyes in a silent prayer. She couldn't conceive a life without her husband, but over the last few weeks it had seemed that she was likely to lose the man she loved. The doctors had not skirted around the sobering truth or been evasive, but they had definitely avoided looking her straight in the eye. They had told her that while her husband was dangerously ill, very sick, they simply could not diagnose his condition, and had no idea what was causing the gradual decline in his health. They believed that if he continued on his grim path, that he was unlikely to survive past 6 months. This was something she'd never ever shared with her 2 sons, whom adored their father. How could she tell them something monumental like this, when they were hanging on to the life raft of hope, believing that he would recover? But deep down in her heart, Erica doubted that he ever would. She also knew, although she had never discussed the poor state of her husband's health with her children, they unequivocally knew that their father was dying. Her kids were exceedingly bright. You couldn't pull the wool over their eyes. This was why at the hospital, the normally demure woman, who never offended people with her guarded words, had spoken her mind to that pompous doctor, whom was always persuading her that the very best place for her husband was the hospital. She had walked into that hospital, following the script in her head. She was determined that even if this was their last Christmas, their father was going to spend it with his family. Come hell or high water, he was going to be discharged. Of course the doctors had tried to sow doubt in her mind, and that was expected, like the ugly stitches on a pair of newly darned socks.
"But are you sure this is wise, Mrs. Paxman? Here at the hospital your husband can be carefully monitored, his pain managed."
"I believe, Doctor, that my husband needs a break from this inauspicious place, some quality time to spend with his children. You yourself say you don't know how much time he's got left. He deserves to spend Christmas with his family." To her amazement, the doctor had relented and agreed,
that sometimes it did patients good to have a break from the hospital. Mrs. Erica Paxman did not believe her husband was dying any more. No way! Something magical had happened in this cabin. She could not put a finger on it, but she knew she was staring at a miracle. Bobby went to bed feeling on top of the world that night. He knew his father was better. There was no doubt about that in his mind. He didn't understand how it had happened, but he knew in his gut that his father was not going to die. He promptly decided that this was quite literally the best Christmas he'd ever had. He lay there in his bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sound of the wailing wind outside, when his brother interrupted his chain of thoughts. "Bobby, are you awake?" he whispered. "Yes, I am. I couldn't get to sleep. I've been thinking, you see." "Me too," came his reply. "Daddy is better, isn't he, Bobby? Something strange happened today. I once heard in church that miracles can happen around Christmas time. Maybe God performed a miracle on Daddy. I've been praying, you know, an awful lot since he got sick." "I know Daddy is better," Bobby told his brother. "He had 2 helpings of Christmas pudding today. 2 helpings, can you believe it? I can't even eat that much Christmas pudding. I would get so sick if I ate that much. He ate more Christmas turkey and ham than me, and I've never seen him pig out so much. Mum tried to stop him. She told him he had to stop eating so much that his stomach had shrunk, but he wouldn't listen. He kept saying, 'Leave me be. I'm really hungry.'" It was later that night that the Paxman family is woken to the sounds of something beating their cabin really loudly. It didn't sound like the punneling wind or the blizzard that was whipping across the landscape at all. This sounded like something very big was beating their cabin like a drum. Could it be a bear, Bobby wondered? Of course not. They were in hibernation, he reminded himself. Bobby, now naturally very curious, hurriedly climbed out of his bed, slipping his cold feet into his fleece-lined slippers, wrapping his tartan dressing gown snugly around him, tying the belt around the waist in a sailor's knot. He trotted over to the window to look out between the crack in the curtain. At first he was greeted to the dark blanket of night that wore its velvety cloak quite proudly, but the soft whispers of moonlight stole some of the blackness away, so that parts of the night were swathed in a silvery glaze. Bobby can hear his father's booming voice, that over the last few weeks had become as soft as a church mouse. "What's going on out there? Something's out there." Bobby's mother's voice sounded panicky. "I'm scared. I'm really scared. What's going on? Who's banging our cabin like this?" Both Bobby's parents seemed rather troubled. Bobby looks out of the window. He suddenly sees these dark, big silhouettes, 3 of them. They're standing several feet away from the cabin, and appear to be engaged in earnest conversation. Their pyramid-shaped heads seem to be nodding in agreement. They cast troubled eyes in the direction of the cabin. The mysterious creatures were standing on the edge of the woodgrove, with long timber beams in their hands, which Bobby suspected they'd been using moments before to bang the eaves of the cabin. They had stopped for a minute's reprieve or a wool-gathering session. Even watching them from the bedroom, bathed in the obscurity of the moonlight, they appeared to be not at all aggressive in their demeanour. So why are they banging the cabin like this? What do they want? Bobby is convinced these mysterious cryptid creatures must be Bigfoot, but they're far too indeterminate to see clearly, owing to the selective lighting of the moon and the dingy twilight. They're huge and bulky, with humanoid physiques, covered in long flowing dark hair, which is so dark that the silhouettes of the trees are equally as dark as they are. Coal, that's the colour he suspects they are. They're either black as coal or a very dark brown, Bobby decides. The creatures glide towards the cabin again, and the banging starts all over, causing everyone in the cabin to become exceedingly alarmed. "Something's out there," says Mrs. Paxman. "I'll be damned if I go out and face whatever it is."
"Well, maybe I should go out and see what it is."
"No, you can't possibly do that. I'll call for help." Mrs. Paxman tries to phone for some kind of help, but she can't get a signal on her cell phone. It had been working perfectly yesterday when she'd phoned her sister.
They could hear the crashing sounds of rocks and timber beating against the cabin, followed by grunts and howls. Then everything stops, and whatever had been harassing them just disappears and goes away, and peace is once again restored in the household. The family is quick to forget about their former angst. The mind can be remarkably resilient when the need arises. Let's just say the marvellous recovery of Mr. Paxman's health had stolen the limelight of their focus, and the banging seemed to pale into the shadows of obscurity and be long since forgotten about.
"I think it was 3 Bigfoot banging at the cabin,"
Bobby told his mother.
"They were beating our cabin with timber sticks."
Erica Paxman rubs her son's hair affectionately. "I don't think it was Bigfoot, darling," she said. "You've got a fertile imagination, little Bobby. Do you know what I think? Me and your father have uncovered what is actually going on. I happen to know from Mrs. Wensleydale that one of the larger cabins around here, very close to ours as it happens, has been rented out by a mother with 5 spirited teenagers. My bet is they're trying to scare us silly, as they have nothing better to do, probably bored out of their skulls. Teenagers can do nonsensical things at times, so it's nothing to worry about at all. The best thing to do is to ignore it. Your father is in agreement that this is what is going on." Bobby knew better than to argue with his mother, but he was in no doubt what he'd seen. He knew the banging on the eaves of the cabin had not been from teenagers. On Boxing Day things were so good, especially with Mr. Paxman eating so well. He looked incredibly healthy. It was hard to believe he'd been sick at all. They had all donned their snowshoes and gone exploring in the white countryside together as a family, but Bobby could not shake the ominous feeling that they were being watched and even stalked. "I hope those teenagers don't come back tonight to bang at the cabin again. It's so annoying," says Mrs. Paxman, putting her children to bed, giving them both a kiss. "But if they do, I don't want either of you to worry. Just ignore them." "We saw those teenagers on Christmas Day, early in the morning, didn't we, Bobby?" "Yes, we did. They were throwing snowballs together and shrieking. Their cabin is the closest one to ours." "Well, don't you worry about them at all, if they get up to their old tricks," said Mrs. Paxman. "The best thing, as I keep telling you over and over again, is to ignore them. Then they'll go away. They want attention. They want us to be scared out of our skins. That's the entire idea of this game. So they will get bored like they did last night. I don't think when I was a teenager I would have drawn pleasure by scaring someone else half to death. But the both of you take no notice if they do come back, and that's a big if." "Daddy's going to be better, isn't he, Mummy?" Bobby asked his mother. She sat on the edge of the bed and smiled. "You know what, Bobby? Your father is a different man. I've almost forgotten he's sick at all. Do you know he ate 4 Danish pastries at breakfast? He had a 3rd helping of my turkey pie at lunch, and I was worried about it. You know, in the Holocaust, after those starved people were fed again, they had to feed them a tiny little bit at a time. If they ate large amounts of food, it would have killed them on the spot. That's why I was worried about your father eating so much. But he seems not to be having any trouble at all eating all that food. The mind boggles. You'd think his stomach would have naturally shrunk. You know those people who have bariatric surgery to make their stomach shrink to the size of a fist, so they're forced to eat tiny amounts of food so that they lose lots of weight? Well, the stomach naturally does that when you're starving. So how does your father fit all that food into his stomach? God only knows. He got on the scale this morning. He's put on 2.5 pounds. Nobody puts on weight that quick if they're sick. Yes, Bobby, to answer your question, I believe emphatically that your father is better." "Did you hear that, bro?" said Bobby, sighing happily. "Mum thinks Dad is definitely better. That's the best Christmas present of all." "It sure is. I couldn't have asked for a better one myself." Bobby drifted off to sleep, in a trice like a fly caught up in a silken spidery web. He finds himself caught up in the throes of a deep, very lucid dream, the likes that he's never experienced before. He's standing in the woodgrove. The trees are whispering his name. "Bobby, Bobby, Bobby." "I'm here," he says. "I'm here." The forest is covered in a vaporous white mist, and in this mist he sees 3 figures standing behind it. The tallest of these ambiguous figures pulls back the foggy, vaporous curtain of mist and steps forward to reveal himself to Bobby. The Herculean-sized figure is a Bigfoot. He's looking at Bobby directly with pleading eyes. He extends out his large hands with fingers as big as sausages. "Give it back, Bobby," he says. "It's not yours to keep." The figure then turns around and glides away. Bobby wakes up with a start. Sweat is trickling down his face. The dream was so vivid, so real. The Bigfoot had appeared to him in the dream, asked him to give it back. Give what back? He wondered. It was a dream, he thought. I'm being so silly. The way those Bigfoots had walked through the mist, the dream felt as if they had come to him from another world. But never in his life had Bobby experienced such a tangible dream. He had even been able to smell the pine of the woodgrove. How was that possible? Then he hears it, the banging on the eaves of the cabin. It's the Bigfoots, he thinks to himself. They were speaking to me in the dream. It was real. They want something from me, but what? He can hear his mother's voice trailing down the passage. "It's those teenagers, playing games. Ignore them." Bobby barely hears his mother's voice, as the feeling that the Bigfoots want something from him just becomes all-consuming. And then a picture of the necklace he found in the wood with the carved leaves and eagle's feathers comes into his mind with an illumination that leaves him in no doubt. The banging of the outside cabin stops. A voice comes into his head that Bobby would describe later as like the voice of God. "We are waiting for you. Bring it to us. We want it back. It is not yours to keep." Oh my God, thinks Bobby. I gave it to my father for Christmas. I better get it back from him. Bobby tiptoes into his parents' bedroom. His father was snoring. He didn't even look ill anymore. His father's head is facing towards his mother, his neck facing towards Bobby. Bobby managed to untie the necklace, and it slipped off easily off his father's neck. He then gathers it together and discovers it's warm to the touch. Very warm. How odd, he thought. Bobby crept through the passage towards the front door of the cabin and opened it very gently. A cold wind whipped against his face. He shivered with cold as he stood there in the doorway, staring out into the dark. There was a mist that hovered above the snow, and the moonlight that danced through this foggy haze made everything glittery and ethereal, as if the mist itself was covered in a confetti of twinkling silver and gold glitter. Everything about the night seemed outer-worldly and magical. He could swear he heard the tinkling of bells. And much like his vivid, explicit dream, the Bigfoot walked through a chiffon-like veil. He is staring at 3 of them close up. They're very intimidating, but Bobby is more in awe of them than fearful. There is something imposing and magisterial about these remarkable creatures, whose faces are so human and noble-looking, with intelligent eyes that are very discerning. When the large Bigfoot looked into Bobby's eyes, he held them for a long time. Bobby was certain the creature knew everything there was to know about him, as if he was reading his very soul, his heart, and even his life path. The Bigfoot spoke to Bobby in a strange language that was immediately downloaded into his mind in English, faster than any computer, which Bobby found extraordinary. I mean, how did that happen? These creatures had outer-worldly powers that we humans could only dream about. Imokolana agashagavanon igina golawana. Could you please give it to us? He said, stretching out his hand. Bobby reached out to give the Bigfoot the necklace. I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was yours. I'm sorry I took it. I gave it to my father for Christmas. The Bigfoot took the necklace from Bobby, holding it in his hands, and then he nodded. Omakila, hoshofana saka. Thank you for giving it back to us. The 3 Bigfoot nodded at him, and Bobby watched them disappearing into the mist, and then they were gone. See, I told you, said their mother the following morning. The teenagers tried to pull off that stunt last night by banging at the rafters, but we didn't bite the bait, did we? So they ran away. I guarantee they won't be back. Has anyone seen the necklace Bobby gave me for Christmas?
asked Mr. Paxman. "I seem to have misplaced it somewhere."
"No, sweetheart, I haven't seen it," said Mrs. Paxman. "But I'm sure you'll find it lying somewhere around. Maybe it fell off your neck." Bobby felt really bad about returning the necklace to the Bigfoot because he'd deprived his father of a Christmas present that his father had become clearly attached to. Still, there was nothing he could do about it. The necklace needed to be returned to its rightful owners, but Bobby wasn't going to tell his parents about everything that had transpired. But he was sure there was something magical about that necklace, as after his father had worn it, he had suddenly become well again. The next day something quite extraordinary happened. His mother said, "Oh, look, sweetheart, I've found your necklace." It was on the patio, would you believe it?
"Oh, that is a relief," said Mr. Paxman. "I'm very attached to the necklace that Bobby gave me. The moment I wore it, I felt so much better. So I'm naturally very fond of it."
Bobby was amazed that there was a leather necklace in his mother's hands that did not remotely resemble the necklace that he'd given his father. There was just one amulet of a leaf carved out from bone and one eagle's feather, but it seemed that no member of his family appeared to realize it wasn't the same necklace, so Bobby didn't say anything. Had the Bigfoots managed to persuade his parents in their minds that it was the same necklace he'd given his father for Christmas? It would seem so. 1 week later, Mr. Paxman is sitting in the doctor's office, looking the picture of health. In 1 week he'd gained some healthy weight. His cheeks were no longer sunken, his eyes no longer hollow. The doctor scratches his head nonplussed.
"Mr. Paxman, I will be straight with you. I have no idea how it is remotely possible you have made such a marvellous swift recovery from a mysterious, enigmatic illness that almost certainly was killing you. I've seen some miraculous miracles in my time, believe me I have, but nothing that beats this. And your weight gain over the last week is simply extraordinary. You are without doubt a walking miracle, Mr. Paxman."
Even all these years later, my father still wears his lucky amulet around his neck. But I never told him that I believed something magical belonging to Bigfoots brought him back from the very brink of death. And whatever it was a Christmas miracle. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Angus Buchanan found himself pulling out outside one of the exquisite palatial houses on the Battery in East Battery Street, which he considered the most beautiful street in Charleston, Carolina. The Battery is a distinguished landmark, defensive seawall and promenade that fortifies the southern tip of the city, overlooking the harbour. Angus parks his van outside one of the stately homes, possibly built in the 17th or early 18th century, overlooking the prepossessing views of the harbour. The blue water glitters brightly in the morning light. He can see the silhouettes of a couple of sailboats with their white sails blasting against the cool wind, and a luxury yacht on the horizon, while the sky is a cobalt blue, without even a hint of a fluffy cloud in sight. There are dozens of sable palm trees, penciling up into the sky, standing in front of the stately-looking mansions on the promenade, where slender vertical ribbons of grass and pristinely perfectly manicured mown hedges fringe the tiny front yards of these ornate, grandiose, luxurious dwellings that wear their history like a noteworthy badge of honour. Angus climbs out of the delivery truck. He's working for a butcher that specialises in selling grass-fed Aberdeen Angus beef for a very elite, selective, affluent clientele. The people who live along East Battery Street can easily afford such luxuries. Angus knows this road very well. He hates his job working as a delivery driver, but what can he do about it? It's either this or being forced to work for his grandfather on his South Carolina farm for a large chunk of his life, which is not what he wanted to do. Angus would love to own his own farm, but working for his grandfather indefinitely, that was no life for him. Angus is sitting in his truck for a moment, taking stock. What must it be like to have this kind of wealth? The historic houses along the street go for millions of dollars. They are beautiful and proudly stand up in their lofty majesty basking audaciously under the sun, with a haughty superior pride, and a whole lot to be proud about. They're probably as stuck-up, pretentious, and elitist as their owners, Angus thinks privately to himself. It's on this stunning street, when his thoughts are rudely intruded by the loud shrieks and rude squawks of the gulls flying above his truck. That is when he sees her. A young woman in her early 20s is walking along the street, pushing a rather tatty second-hand stroller in her hands. She's glancing up at the houses, as if she's looking for a particular number. What could she possibly want with any of these owners in a street like this, unless she's looking for a job as a nanny or a housemaid? She looks distinctly out of place, Angus decides, for an area like this, and not even smart enough to be applying for a nanny's position. The woman living here on the promenade would likely be pushing on luxurious strollers, probably donned to the nines in their glitzy designer workout gear, with their personal trainer following close behind them, encouraging them to speed walk or to run while pushing their strollers to increase their heart rates and get their post-pregnancy bodies back into shape, so they look glamorous for their next gala event or charity dinner. The young woman is wearing a sundress that looks like it's been through the washing cycle over 1,000 times. No woman on the street would dare to be seen wearing a dress like this. It looks well worn, tattered even, as if it's been bought from a thrift shop. There's something about the young woman's reluctant walk, her obvious hesitancy, that grabs Angus's attention. She keeps looking up and down the silent street, as if making absolutely sure that no one is around and no one is watching her. When she looks in Angus's direction, he hurriedly buries his head behind the van's front panel, so she doesn't see him. Why he impulsively does this, he's not sure. The young woman looks furtive, but also troubled at the same time, an uncomfortable tangle of emotions. She's clearly up to something, Angus can sense in his gut, but what? The woman stands outside the big mansion, staring up at it. It's the house where Angus is about to make his delivery. She leans into the stroller and appears to be talking lovingly to her baby. There are tears spilling down her cheeks. In a trice the woman composes herself, wipes away her tears, straightens up her back, and skulkingly moves to the gleaming black front door, with its smart bronze knocker. She rings the bell, positioning the stroller in front of the door, so it can't possibly be missed. Then she abandons it, bolting down the street in a tearing hurry, running away as fast as she can, barely stopping to draw breath. Angus can see her throwing herself into a battered old red Toyota Yaris that looks like it's as bedraggled as its owner. The woman drives away at breakneck speed, in a tearing hurry. What the heck, he thinks. Why did she abandon the stroller like this? He climbs out of his white Ford Transit truck, with the logo Hickory Dickory Meat. He walks over to the stroller, and he can see a tiny baby lying fast asleep, dressed in a blue onesie and covered in a white cotton blanket. There's a bag in the stroller, filled with formula, nappies, and a note. To Mr. and Mrs. Harris, I know you're people of means. I've also done my research, and understand you've already adopted a child of your own. So I'm sure you must be very good people, who would have the heart to take in my baby and adopt him as your own. All my life I have struggled financially, and I doubt things will change in that regard. I cannot look after my little boy, but I want him to have the opportunities in life that were never given to me, which is why I have chosen and selected a wealthy family of privilege like yourself, whom I know have already adopted a child. I am crossing my fingers that you will choose to adopt my boy as your own. But if you can't, I do hope you will select a loving home for him. I know my son's father comes from Irish descent, and my family is originally from Maine. I do not know of any genetic diseases or disorders in my family line. I want you to know giving my little boy up is the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my entire life. I want him to know that after he was born, holding him in my arms was the very best moment of my life. Please let him know he was always loved, and it is because of this great love that I am leaving him with you. I want him to have the very best life has to offer, and this is the hardest decision I've ever had to make. Angus stares at the note incredulously and stuffs it in the back pocket of his jeans. Then a bizarre thought comes into his mind. He can use this baby as leverage to get exactly what he wants. The door of the grandiose old house opens promptly. Mrs. Harris, the owner, is standing in the doorway expectantly. She'd been ardently waiting for Angus's delivery. She's a kind woman in her 40s, who's always well presented, like most of the wealthy elite in these parts, without a single hair out of place, thanks to her illustrious hairstylist, a man called Franco Fiorentino, who's all the rage among the well-heeled in these parts. But she always treats Angus with respect. "Hello, Angus. It's great to see you, young man. Have you got my Aberdeen Angus there?"
"Yes, I have," says Angus.
"Good. My husband is looking forward to a steak dinner tonight, with only the finest grass-fed beef." "Goodness gracious me! What is that tatty-looking stroller doing out here?"
"Oh, it's mine. I must apologise, Mrs. Harris. It's my baby in there, you see. I thought I'd take him for a walk down the promenade to enjoy the fabulous views over the harbour. You're the last delivery on my list today. You do live in the most stunning street in South Carolina," he says, pointing at the views.
"Do you know, Angus, you're absolutely right about that. I'm a very spoilt woman, you know. Sometimes I don't realise how good I have it. I do apologise about how rude I've been about your stroller." Mrs. Harris looks wistfully at the scenery. "It is magnificent out there, and such a lovely day. So often I fail to appreciate just how lucky I am. I glance out at these views every day, and I'm quick to take things for granted. But my little 7-year-old Stephen, I adopted him very soon after he was born, you know. Well, he brings me down to earth with a great big mighty bang. There's nothing like a kid to do that for you. You don't mind, Angus, if I have a little look at your baby? I do love babies so much."
"Of course not," said Angus. "Be my guest."
"Oh, isn't he absolutely adorable? What a delight! What perfect blue eyes! And he's got such a charming little nature. I think he is laughing at me. Let me tell you, when I adopted my Stephen, he was as small as this one is," says Mrs. Harris, oohing and eyeing at the little baby. Angus can see why the discerning young woman had dropped her baby off outside Mrs. Harris's house. She clearly knew that the woman would adopt her son. She must have been watching the residents in the street very carefully, and how they interacted with their children, he concluded. Or somehow she found out about Mrs. Harris. "Oh, he is quite delightful," said Mrs. Harris. "One of the most beautiful babies I've ever seen. Oh, look at that teddy bear. Did your wife make it? I've never seen one quite like it. It's magnificently stitched. It's like a patchwork teddy bear. Something you'd buy from a designer boutique. Where did you get it?"
"No, my wife didn't make it. I think she got it from a friend who makes them. Now, what about your delivery, Mrs. Harris?"
"Oh, of course. We can't forget my husband's steaks. I'd never hear the end of it. I'd happily be a vegetarian, you know. But my husband, he cannot live without his meat, and only the best will ever do. It has to be grass-fed."
Angus chuckles. "Well, there is no accounting for good taste, is there, Mrs. Harris?" he says, dashing to his van to retrieve the parcel of meat for Mrs. Harris to sign.
"Off with you, dear, then. The weather is quite spectacular, the view's magnificent. You go and enjoy that walk of yours with your gorgeous little son." She leans into the pram. "Goodbye, little one. It's been quite a pleasure to meet you. Be good for your little daddy, will you?"
"Goodbye, Mrs. Harris."
"Goodbye, Angus." Angus quickly bundles the baby into the back of his delivery truck and folds up the stroller, which he tosses into the back of the truck. Thank God Mrs. Harris was his last delivery for the day. He immediately drives out of Charleston towards his father's farm, and for the first time in his life he can smell victory in the air, almost taste it on his tongue. It was like fate had serendipitously smiled down upon him, auspiciously from the sky, whispering into his heart, Angus, this is your lucky day. Your life is about to change exponentially from now on. What a stroke of luck, he thought, to stumble across that stroller, quite by chance. It was over an hour and a half's drive to his grandfather's farm, where Angus had grown up as a boy. He loved his grandparents. They were good people, but he didn't like the way they wanted to dictate the course of his life. They were desirous for him to live on their farm indefinitely, but Angus wanted a farm all of his own, and he had the very place in mind that had been on the market for over a week now. Angus needed his own independence, without having his grandparents breathing down his back every minute of the day, telling him how to live his life, to do this and to do that. His grandparents were well-meaning, but their control over his life had been suffocatingly oppressive, which was why he was renting a crappy apartment in Charleston and working for a specialised family-run butchery 24/7. Both of his grandparents were affluent. The wealth came from his grandmother's side of the family. Money was not a subject his grandparents ever discussed in front of him growing up. His grandmother would say talking about money was exceedingly vulgar and in very poor taste. Angus had never known his mother. She had fallen pregnant with him at 15 years old and clandestinely hidden her pregnancy from her parents. Once Angus was born in the upstairs bathroom, she had abandoned her baby and run away from home, with a note telling her mother and father, "Sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen. Don't try and find me." Despite his grandparents' very best efforts, his mother had never been found, but they had never stopped trying to locate their daughter's whereabouts by hiring numerous private investigators, but to no avail. Everything led to a dead end. It was their daughter running away from them as a little girl that had probably made his grandparents very controlling and possessive over Angus's life, as if they were afraid of letting him go, as that would be like losing their beloved daughter all over again, as he was the only part of their daughter they had left. Soon the delivery truck he used for his job was humming down the long driveway that was fringed on one side with viridescent green fields of soya-bean crops, and on the other side was a plethora of trees. In a trice he was parked outside his grandparents' farmhouse. He climbed out of the car, taking the little bundle out of the passenger side door into his arms. He was surprised how well behaved this little baby was. It gurgled and chuckled happily, looking up at him with its round blue eyes. Even Angus found himself quite charmed by the little bundle. For the first time in his young life, Angus felt exceedingly empowered, really empowered. He knew his grandparents would bite the bait, and he would be able to dictate the size of the catch. He was certain about that. The door of the farmhouse was swiftly flung open by Angus's grandfather, who was called Beaver. Angus had never known him by any other name. His grandmother had told him Beaver had earned his name from his industrious determination to get things done. It was true, his grandfather was exceedingly efficient. Angus watches his grandfather standing in the doorway, his bright eyes twinkling. The man was wearing a red plaid jacket and a pair of blue jeans. Angus can see his father look surprised but rather pleased to see him. His blue eyes sweep over the bundle in his arms. Perturbed, they grow significantly rounder and rounder, and his mute unspoken words ring into Angus's ears. "What have you got there? Is that bundle what I think it is? It's not a baby, is it?" But he doesn't say a thing. Things had gone better than Angus could have ever imagined. His grandparents, or shall I say his grandmother, had bitten the bait better than he could have ever envisaged. "So what happened exactly?" asked his grandmother, who had taken the baby from Angus's arms and was rocking it in her arms tenderly, talking all kinds of nonsense to it. "Aren't you a sweet little one? Oh, look at you!" The little baby's hands were clasping hers. It wrapped its tiny little fingers into hers, looking into his grandmother's eyes adoringly. Angus could see his grandmother was smitten. This was a very promising start. "Oh, look at him! Oh, my God, he's so adorable! What is all this about, Angus? Who does this baby belong to?" She pauses for a moment, as if she's been hit over the head with a large brick. "It's not your baby, is it, Angus?"
It is my baby, and I hasten to say, your great-grandchild," said Angus proudly,
surprised at how fluidly the lie rolled off his tongue. "I had a relationship with a girl called Angie 9 months ago. A very flaky type. You know what I mean. Head all over the place. All kinds of issues. Not very stable. Well, unfortunately, I made her pregnant. She dumped the baby on me this morning. Said she was in a right mood, let me just tell you that. She got very, very stroppy. Said she didn't want our baby. It was my responsibility. I was to take care of it or put it up for adoption. She didn't care. She dumped the baby on me this morning. She was in a right old mood. She can get very stroppy. She said she didn't want our baby. It was my responsibility, and that I was to take care of it or put it up for adoption. She didn't care."
"She dumped her baby on you," said his grandmother, looking appalled. "Everyone knows a baby belongs with its mother. Why would she do such a dreadful thing? She sounds incredibly selfish, if you ask me. I'll say this for you, Angus. You do know how to pick them. The last girlfriend you brought around to the house was really quite dreadful. No manners at all, and an unbridled tongue on her that caused great offence, I might add. I didn't appreciate her saying I looked like Nancy Reagan. Do you have any idea how old that woman is?"
"I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it, Mum. In her day, Nancy Reagan was a very elegant woman, you know."
Grace growled.
"That's not what she meant, and you know it, Angus. She was inadvertently telling me I was old, and I did not appreciate that." "All right, I admit it. You're right, Gran. I don't have the best track record with women. Let's just say Angie wouldn't know responsibility a day in her life. She wants nothing to do with the baby. So I came here so that you could have first refusal."
Angus's grandmother looks confounded. She runs her weathered hand through her mane of silvery curls and gives him a puzzled look. "Stop speaking in riddles, Angus. I hate it when you do that. What do you mean by first refusal?"
Angus's back straightened. "I'm going to get my baby put up for adoption. If you want to raise your great-grandson, then you're going to pay me for the privilege. Otherwise, I shall dump him at the first adoption agency. You might think that that is cruel, but it's the way it is. You can see I am not equipped to look after a baby. Of course, I would like to, but I don't have the time on my hands. I'm far too busy for that."
"What are you trying to do? Blackmail me, Angus?" asked his grandmother, "because I don't like the sound of that. I raised you better than that."
"Blackmail? What are you saying? Absolutely not. What do you take me for, Granny? I'm just being extremely practical. I can't look after my baby, but you both can. You know I don't want to work on this farm. I want to own my own place. I need my independence, my freedom. You've got money. I haven't. If you pay me a handsome lump sum, you can raise your great-grandbaby. I can buy myself my own farm. It's a simple business transaction. That's all. You can like it or lump it. You can't say I'm not playing fair. I could have handed your great-grandbaby over to the adoption agency, and you would be none the wiser about his existence. But as you can see, I'm giving you a choice, and that is a privilege. I'm being incredibly reasonable towards you. Do you want to raise your great-grandbaby or not? Would you like a perfect stranger to raise him? Would you like to abandon your own flesh and blood? I know how devastated you were when my mother ran away from home when she was 15 years old. You wouldn't want to lose this one, would you?"
"Of course I don't want to abandon my great-grandbaby. He's absolutely adorable. But Angus, I'm not getting any younger. I'm just about 70 years old. How can I look after a baby? I'm getting long in the tooth, you could say."
"No, you're not, piped Angus. Age is only a state of mind. You know it is. You don't even look a day over 50. You've always been robustly healthy. Of course you can look after your great-grandchild. Unless, of course, you want me to hand him over to the adoption agency.
which I think would be a dreadful pity. Think about it. You'd never see your great-grandson again. Besides, if you need help, you've got lots of money to hire a nanny to work for you. She could move into the farmhouse, help you take care of your grandchild." "You've got it all worked out, Angus, haven't you?" said his grandmother incredulously. "But you're right, we can hire a full-time nanny. I'll be damned if my great-grandson is raised by strangers." She lifts the baby up in her arms, her face lighting up. "Oh, he is so beautiful, so totally and utterly beautiful." The baby gurgles, staring at her with its bright blue eyes so curiously, and he can see his grandfather has bitten the bait. She looks quite flustered. Her skin has grown pink, as if she suddenly feels quite excited about the prospect of looking after her great-grandson. Angus cannot believe how easy things are going. He has his grandmother hooked. She'll never want to give up her great-grandson. Angus has all the trump cards in his hands. If this was a game of poker, he'd have a royal flush. "What is his name?" she asks Angus with big eyes. Angus thinks quickly on his feet. "His name is Harris," which is the only name that comes tumbling into his head, after having delivered meat to Mrs. Harris only moments before. But ironically, it's not a bad name for a boy, he thinks. "Harris," says his grandmother. "Now that's quite a lovely name. I think our little Harris here needs his nappy changed, and I'm sure he's hungry. I'm glad to see that your girlfriend at least got some diapers and a change of clothes for him. I mean, what on earth is wrong with that woman, wanting to abandon her baby like this? She sounds like quite the most ghastly woman. I'm so glad you never introduced me to her." "So, Granny, do we have a deal or not?" asked Angus. "Well, it's not like I have much of a choice in the matter, do I? I can't see I've got lots of options," says his grandmother, looking up at Angus soberly. "You know I can't abandon my great-grandchild, put him in the arms of strangers. How could I possibly live with myself? So yes, Angus, we have a deal. Beaver, get me my checkbook, will you?" Angus can see his grandfather shaking his head. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Grace? Aren't we a bit long in the tooth to raise our great-grandchild? And do you realize our Angus is bribing you?" "Beaver, are you listening to me or not? I don't want to have to ask you again. Get me my checkbook," came his grandmother's stern voice. "Our great-grandchild's fate is not for your discussion. I will not have a perfect stranger raising our great-grandchild under any circumstances. That is non-negotiable. Our great-grandson needs us. He is our flesh and blood, and I, for one, will never abandon him. Besides, Angus is absolutely right. We can hire a nanny to move in with us to help us care for the child. It's a win-win situation. And we could do with a spirited child in our lives again. It's been lonesome for us since Angus left home. Maybe it's not going to be so hard if Angus does buy his own place. I'm sure he will be around here frequently to visit his son. I'm quite sure we can make this work and give Harris the great life he deserves." Angus's heart thunders with excitement as his grandmother pulls out her checkbook from her leather handbag that Beaver handed over to her with an air of reluctance. But this is family money from her side of the family, and she can dictate how the money is spent. So Beaver doesn't have much of a say in the matter. Thank God, thinks Angus. Beaver would be a tough nut to crack, not so easy to bring out his checkbook, but his grandmother can be more easily duped. "How much?" she asks Angus, lifting her pen over the checkbook. "How much, Angus?" Angus would ask for $1.5 million. That would be a great start. If the rumours were remotely true, his grandmother could easily afford it. If she wasn't that rich, she'd reason with him and bring the price right down, but it was always good to aim big. $1.5 million, Granny. It's a small price to pay for little Harris here, and you know you can afford it. Angus can see his grandfather's jaw drop open. His eyes grow round. "You're asking for a hell of a lot, son. Aren't you being a wee bit unreasonable on your grandmother? Well, do you want your great-grandbaby or not? I told you this is a business transaction. It's not personal. It is what it is. Like it or lump it." Angus sees his grandmother scribbling on her cheque.
which she hands to him with her trembling hand. Angus studies the cheque, his eyes growing round. It's made out to him personally, and it's for $1.5 million. He's hit the jackpot. I'll confirm the cheque with the bank, his grandmother tells him reassuringly. I'll get them to transfer it into your account as soon as possible. Angus wanted to whoop with joy, but he maintained his composure. Thanks, Gran. You won't regret it. And don't see me out. Angus wasted no time in driving to the farmhouse that was up for sale, half an hour away from his parents' farmhouse, that was having an open day today for potential buyers to look at the premises. As Angus's delivery truck rolls down the drive of this prepossessing part of land in South Carolina, he cannot believe the serendipitous events of the morning. And to think he so nearly called in sick this morning, with a headache. He could have lost all this. The farm had previously been a cattle ranch, but the couple selling it were retiring. But the moment he'd seen the property, Angus knew he wanted it at once. He drove down the long sweeping corridors of the red dirt roads, covered with archways of tall trees, which were tangled sculptural boughs from either side of the road that weaved into each other. Finally he takes a swift right-hand turn, and finds himself driving through the wrought iron gates and picket fence, down the long driveway that leads to a stunning federal-style red-bricked farmhouse. The house was nestled against a billowing backdrop of trees, and on the right-hand side of the house was an ocean of meadows that stretched out for many miles. From the moment Angus had seen the farmhouse, he'd fallen for the place, hook, line and sinker. But without the money to buy the place, he could see his dream slipping through his fingers like butter. But not today. Things were different today. The air smelled fresher, the world seemed brighter and so much more agreeable. When he climbed out of his truck, he could see the smug, self-entitled estate agent standing in the doorway of the farmhouse with a frown on his face. The man was clearly not pleased to see Angus yet again, and Angus knew why. The man didn't like time-wasters bothering him. They were like annoying flies he wanted to swat. He thinks he's all that, Angus told himself, dressed to the nines in his expensive pinstripe suit and pointed shiny crocodile shoes, and looks completely out of place on a farm like this. You again, he snipes when he sees Angus. As you can see, I'm presenting an open day for people who can actually afford to buy this farm. Not for time-wasters like yourself, who want to own this place but simply haven't got the means. I'll pretend I didn't hear that, shall I? As it happens, I am here to make you an offer for the place. I will give you the full asking price, and you can't say fairer than that. Yeah, like I believe that in a month of Sundays. You don't have the money. I do. Angus pulls out his mother's cheque. I'll be depositing this into my bank account when I return to town. You can phone up the bank to see if they're expecting a transfer of these funds, and this cheque is legitimate. After which you can phone up the sellers and say it's a cash offer, and I will give them their full asking price. Is that a deal or not? The estate agent gawked at Angus, looking bemused. He made a couple of phone calls to confirm with the bank that the $1.5 million cheque was indeed to be deposited and was legit. He was satisfied, so his demeanour changed. His tight downward scowl turned up into the brightest grin. He suddenly treated Angus as if Angus was his best buddy, and not a lower form of pond life. You've done well for yourself, he said in a saccharine voice. I'm quite sure you will be thrilled with the property, and I'm quite certain the sellers will accept your offer at once. I must apologise, he said, looking bashful, for not thinking you were a legitimate buyer. Well, next time you should not be so quick to judge the book by the cover, should you? We don't all go pouncing around the place in pinstriped suits and debonair boots. It was amazing how money could change people's attitudes towards you, and in the estate agent's case he was clearly getting a high from the smell of his commission cheque. He certainly looked as if he would be popping the champagne once Angus left. What a jerk, he said. A real jerk. 15 years later. Harris enjoyed spending time at his father's farm. He and his father Angus had grown very close in recent years.
Growing up as a young boy, it had struck him as strangely enigmatic that he didn't bear the family characteristics physically. He had dark hair and a long Irish face, and blue eyes, whereas everyone else in his family had more of a square jawline, and very aristocratic noses with a pointed tip, but he didn't resemble them at all. His grandmother had told him that this was likely due to the fact that he might bear a striking resemblance to his mother's side of the family. It was only when he saw his father the previous weekend, and asked him a plethora of uncomfortable questions about his birth mother, that his father Angus became exceedingly uncomfortable. Harris could not shake the irksome feeling that there was something about his childhood his father and great-grandparents weren't actually telling him. He had learnt from his great-grandmother Grace that his mother Angie had given birth to him and dumped him on his father, and just disappeared into the sunset, never to be seen or heard from again. "It's not something you should take personally, Harris," she had told him. "According to your father, your mother Angie didn't like to be responsible. She wanted a carefree life, not to be saddled with kids. But the moment I saw you, Harris, I was smitten. For the record, your father was dreadful in his selection of women. Always chose the most unstable woman to date, until he married Peggy. And well, let's just say, that woman is a rock. She's changed your father, made him so much of a better man. I'm quite sure your mother loved you, but she possibly just didn't want the hassle of raising a kid. It's not for everyone, you know." Harris loved his stepmother Peggy. She was the best thing that had ever happened to his father. Peggy was the kind of woman that wore her heart on her sleeve, and absolutely hated secrets of any kind. One weekend when Harris was staying at the farmhouse, he told Peggy his misgivings. He knew he could talk to her about anything. She was a great listener, and she usually had some kind of solution to offer him. "Peggy," he said over breakfast that morning, when Angus was out of earshot. "What is it, Harris?" she asked. "You look, well, what's the word? Confounded, as if there's a weight on your mind. Last weekend, when I was asking Dad about my birth mother, he became very twitchy. I knew he was hiding something from me. Is there something I should know?" Peggy sat down on the chair opposite him and took Harris's hand in hers. "I told your father that if he wasn't going to tell you the truth, that I would. You know what I'm like. I hate secrets of any kind. Now you know your father loves you very much, and so do both of your great-grandparents. But Harris told me that you're not his real son, not by blood, but you are in his heart, of course." "What?" said Harris. "You mean I'm adopted? Why didn't they tell me this?" Peggy pauses for a moment. "No, you're not adopted, nor are you related to your father by blood, or your great-grandparents. It's quite a story, actually. How you came to be the biggest blessing in our lives, myself included. Although what your father did was impulsively foolish, but sometimes mistakes can have silver linings at the end of them, as was in this case. Your father was working for a butchery specializing in grass-fed meat, and he delivered his meat to affluent clients. One day he saw a young woman with a tattered stroller walking up an illustrious street, looking for a Pacific mansion. It was a huge mansion, where the wealthy occupants had already adopted a young child. The woman clearly thought they'd adopt you too, if they found you outside their front door. So she left them a note, telling them how much she loved you, and wanted you to have the best life ever, and she hoped they'd adopt you, and give you the opportunities in life that she could never have. So my mother wasn't this Angie woman, who didn't want me at all." Peggy squeezes Harris's hand again. "Well, your mother obviously did want you, but she clearly couldn't afford to keep you. Or even if she could, she was thinking about what she wanted for you. A good education, I imagine. Fabulous holidays abroad. Great opportunities in life. Stuff that she never had." "But what has that got to do with my dad? I don't understand." "Your father was in love with this farm. It was on the market at the time. He couldn't afford to buy it. He knew your great-great-grandmother had money. So he grabbed you in your stroller rather impulsively, placed you into his truck, hiding your mother's note in his jean pockets. He thought he could use you as leverage." "As leverage?" asked Harris, gasping. "I was used as leverage?" "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know it sounds absolutely ghastly, cold and heartless, but I'm not going to candy-coat it for you. I must confess what Angus did was inexcusable.
He managed to persuade your great-grandmother to pay him big bucks for the privilege of keeping you. They thought you were their real great-grandchild. I don't know how to take this, Peggy. This is way too much to digest. Well, there is one thing I can tell you, Harris, that your father Angus, who sees himself as your father, told me that you are the best thing that has ever happened in his entire life. He told me he did not know it was possible to love this much. And both your great-grandparents believe that you are the greatest blessing that has ever happened in their lives. They're always saying that. They love the bones of you. Don't you ever forget that. But what if they find out that I'm not their legitimate great-grandchild? Will they still love me? I don't think you should tell them that you're not. I don't believe it would change a thing, because they love you to death. But some secrets are best not shared. I think you deserve to know the truth. Angus won't be very pleased I told you all this, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. Thank you, Peggy. I'm not sure whether finding all this out has made me feel any better, but I did have an inkling that something wasn't right. I'm not sure how I feel about not being related to my father by blood. It doesn't make any difference, sweetheart. Blood doesn't make any difference at all. As far as Angus is concerned, you will always be his son. Do you understand that? I think so. It was later that morning that Harris took himself for a long walk in the woodgrove. He barely noticed what a magnificent morning it was. His mind was naturally all over the place, as he tried to get his head around the fact that the family that had raised him over all these years was not really his real blood family. The soft sunlight filtered through the trees as Harris kicked the ground with his walking boots, and then he saw it. Lying there on the soft earthen ground of the woodgrove was this massive rock-like structure. But where had it come from? He'd never seen anything like it before. In that moment, all thoughts of his family bloodline were expunged from his mind, as an intrigue washed over him, consuming his curiosity. He unhesitantly walked towards the peculiar-looking structure, and on close inspection, it looked like a huge bear had been turned into a rock, becoming petrified or even fossilized. He began to kick at it as hard as he possibly could, and even beat it with a large stick. But the structure was solid, unyielding, very stiff. It was as if the bear had become a stone, but it looked to be a very, very large bear. It couldn't be anything else, but he couldn't see the face, arms, or legs, as the creature seemed to be like one massive ball of hair. But it was as hard as a stone. Harris was genuinely stumped. How could an animal turn into stone? Weren't fossils created over thousands of years? He couldn't wait to get back to the farmhouse, to tell his father about the strange anomaly, and then he remembered that Angus wasn't his father. But it didn't change anything for him. Not really. He loved Angus like a father, and Peggy like a mother, and he adored his great-grandparents, Grace and Beaver. And he'd had the greatest childhood you could ever dream of. He had nothing to complain about. When he returned to the farmhouse after his walk, his father Angus was standing in the doorway, his eyes bleary and red.
"I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean you to find out like this. Peggy wasn't right to tell you all this."
Harris ran into his father's arms. They held each other tightly.
"I want to tell you something, Harris. You will always be my son forever, no matter what. I love you more than life itself. Do you know that?"
"I know that, Dad. I feel the same way about you. You'll always be my father. No one can take that away from you." Harris lay in bed all night at the farmhouse, unable to get a wink of sleep. His mind was racing at 100 miles an hour. He started to think about his real mother, dropping him off in a tatty stroller, outside a fancy house on East Battery Street, overlooking the harbour. She had clearly wanted to sacrifice everything by giving her son the very best that life has to offer.
"You succeeded, Mum. Wherever you are, you succeeded. I had the best childhood anyone could ever ask for."
All of a sudden, the strange anomaly that he'd seen earlier on in the day came shooting back into his head. He had wanted to show his father the strange fossil, but he had forgotten clean about it.
He then heard Peggy talking to his father. "Why don't you come to bed, Angus? You can't stay up all night."
"There's a lot on my mind, Peggy,"
he could hear his father saying. Harris quickly climbed out of bed and trotted over to the living room, where he knew he'd find his father. Angus looked up in surprise to see Harris standing there.
"Why haven't you gone to bed, son? Can't you get to sleep after everything you've been told today?"
"I can't sleep," said Harris. "Like you say, everything you told me. It's a lot to take in."
"I'm sure it is, son. I am sorry about that. I can't sleep either, but I can't say I regret taking you all those years ago from East Battery Street in that stroller. You're the best thing that has ever happened to me."
"Dad, you won't believe what I found in the woodgrove this morning. I found a fossilized bear. It had turned into stone."
"Is this some kind of joke?" asked Angus incredulously. "I mean, animals don't turn into fossils. They don't get petrified like wood, you know."
"I promise you it's true. I tried to beat the stone up, but it was as solid as a rock. But I could tell it had been an animal at one time. It's huge. You can see all the hair very clearly."
"Now this I need to see," says Angus. "Do you fancy an evening stroll, son? It might do us the world of good. Perhaps it'll tire us so we can finally get some sleep tonight."
"Why not?" said Harris. "I want you to see that I'm not making this up." Angus and his son clandestinely slip out of the farmhouse, wearing headlights, heavy walking boots, and carrying rifles just for protection. It's a pleasantly warm summer night, but a cool breeze sweeps across the countryside, so that the trees begin to dance under its fresh nudges. The wind makes the sound of what Harris always describes as respiration or rapid breathing. The illustrious moon hangs inspirationally on the roof of the sky, like a large round golden pendant, accompanied by hundreds of glittering diamonds. It's definitely a full moon tonight. Everything has been cast in that ethereal silvery glaze that lends a magical lustre to the ambience and provides a magnanimous illumination. They can hear the trills of crickets and frogs, the distant hoot of an owl. Angus and Harris trample the earthen trail under their hardened boots. They can hear the twigs beneath their soles snap, crackle, and pop. "What's that strange noise?" whispers Harris. "It sounds like people singing." They clandestinely tiptoe behind the trees towards the strange noise. Angus indicates for his son to follow his lead. They position themselves behind a tree, and what they see baffles them. They switch off their headlights at once. As the light of the moon is so good, they can see the ambiguous creatures very clearly. They see 4 Bigfoot standing over what Harris believed was the fossilized stone of a black bear that he had discovered earlier in the morning. Harris realizes at once that these creatures are definitely Bigfoot, there is no doubt. But he is struck by how human their noble-looking faces are, with the chiseled cheekbones, the sloping foreheads. The creatures are enormous. Harris and his father are sure the smallest must be only 7 foot tall, the largest easily over 9 foot. They're burly, robust, powerfully lofty-looking creatures, covered in long flowing dark hair. Harris and Angus don't even feel an iota of fear, for they are in reverent awe of what is happening before their eyes. Fear does not even entertain their minds, as their intrigue has robbed them of any hesitant reluctancy. They stand there as still as the trees, watching this idiosyncratic ceremony unfold. The largest Bigfoot is wearing a long necklace of eagle's feathers. He appears to be talking in a strange language. It sounds almost like he's chanting. Ika ziva pokolo, ha sinani lona, hi gosh la fakanasi, ha mola bisi, ila nikola fikanasa. All the other Bigfoot put their hands on the big stone that Harris had assumed was a fossil of a bear. The large Bigfoot breathes over the stone, and then suddenly, by magic, it begins to move. Harris hears the sound of crystal shattering, as if the creature on the ground is breaking out of a glass cabinet, and then he stands erect on his 2 feet. It's another Bigfoot. He stretches out his arms above his head and looks up at the other Bigfoots in surprise, with that lost, where am I kind of perturbed look on his face. Harris gets the impression he has no memory of his stone-like incarceration.
The Bigfoots react by whooping in delight, dancing around the forest in glee, as if their friend that had been caught up in a trap is now free. The Bigfoot that had been rescued looks enigmatically puzzled. He scratches his head, and then the other Bigfoots excitedly start talking to him, over each other, so that the Bigfoot can't hear a word of what they're saying. It's like all the Bigfoots want to tell him the story about how he ended up where he is, what had actually happened to him. Something very bizarre must have occurred to him for him to turn into stone like that. But thank God he had no memory of the experience, Harris thought. The large male Bigfoot, wearing the feathers, raises his hand. He whistles. The excited commotion stops at once. He then speaks to the rescued Bigfoot in his language. Opakila, hi shokola na shaka, ha vashalawo, hi silogolin, amanila shonakalasiki. Harris is sure he's telling him what happened. The rescued Bigfoot seems nonplussed. He's nodded as he listens intently, and then he joins in the celebratory mood. And the Bigfoots continue to dance around the woodgrove, beating their large feet on the ground, oscillating their arms above their heads in the air, and letting out whistles and happy whoops. The sound is so intimidating that the trills of the crickets and frogs go mute. Harris and his father watch the Bigfoots for a couple of hours, and then they slip away into the night, returning to the farmhouse. "Son," says Angus, putting his arms around Harris, "encountering the Bigfoots marks the occasion when you found out the real truth about your birth. And I think Peggy's right. It's good that you know the truth, but it doesn't change anything. You're the light of our lives, and you're my son. You saw how excited that those Bigfoot are? Well, I feel just like that, knowing you are around." 6 months later, Harris is in the kitchen with Peggy, helping her prepare blueberry muffins for breakfast. Peggy has taught Harris all she knows about cooking, as the young man has an incredible interest in all things food-related, and Peggy has a sneaking suspicion that Harris might one day become a chef. Suddenly they hear a woman's truck rolling down the driveway and parking directly outside the farmhouse. The woman looks hesitant, as if she's beginning to have a panic attack of some kind, and has lost her nerve. But Peggy, on seeing her, tells Harris to continue preparing the blueberry muffins. She dashes out towards the woman. Harris watches as they engage in a deep conversation together, and then he sees Peggy leading the woman into the kitchen with a broad beam on her face. Harris finds himself staring at a woman who looks a lot like himself. Surely not, he thinks. "Harris," says Peggy, smiling, "this is your birth mother, Claudia Knight." The woman rushes towards Harris, and they both embrace. "Oh, it's wonderful to finally meet you. I'm so sorry I left you in a stroller outside a house all those years ago. I was desperate. I wanted you to have an amazing life, and I knew I couldn't give it to you." "That's all forgiven and forgotten," said Harris. "You did what you thought was best, and for the record, I've had a great life. But how did you find me? I don't understand." "I went to that mansion where I left you as a baby. I was expecting you to be there. I was sure the woman had adopted you. She said there was never a time when she found an abandoned baby in a stroller on her front doorstep. She couldn't remember a time 15 years ago. But then she did remember a delivery driver called Angus, working at a butchery, delivering her meat one morning, who claimed a baby that she saw in a very tatty stroller belonged to him. She believed him that it was his boy, of course, but she did say he was unusually twitchy. I asked her to describe the stroller to me, the baby, what was inside it. Then she talked about the patchwork teddy bear I made you. I knew the man had taken you for some reason. I contacted the butchery, and one of the men working there is still friends with your father, so he gave me your address. He told me that your father had a 15-year-old son, and I knew you were mine. He even found a picture of you on social media, and the resemblance you had to me was uncanny. I only contacted you because I'd like to get to know my son, if that's all right with you." "All right," said Harris. "You bet it's all right. I'd love to get to know you better." To cut a long story short, Harris never told his grandparents he wasn't related to them by blood, but he continued a relationship with his birth mother,
and he believes fate smiled down on him favourably when Angus took him away that fateful day for leverage. As for his experience with the Bigfoots, the strange event of that preposterous night still makes him say, "What the hell was that all about?" He has reached the conclusion that some memories are not meant to be solved. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.